Chapter 201. The Headmaster's Office. It was late, and the castle's 10 o'clock curfew loomed just an hour away. Ron glanced anxiously at the wall clock. We'd better get moving. Filch loves to accidentally catch students out this late just so he can drag them off to his office for detention. He shifted uneasily. He never minded a bit of attention, but being recognized by Harry and Draco only because he was the son of a famous wizard felt embarrassing. Draco blinked at Harry. Wait, Muggles invented the toilet? Harry grinned. Yep, and they've got all sorts of entertainment we've never even dreamed of. Computers, video games, you name it. Neither boy seemed ready to leave. Draco peppered Harry with questions about Muggle life, and Harry dove into an animated explanation of computer hardware and game consoles he'd only read about. Finally, Ron snapped his fingers. Seriously, though, the Philosopher's Stone is gone. What's Dumbledore's reaction? And Nicholas Flamel, does that mean he's doomed? At last, Ron had found a question big enough to earn their full attention. Harry made a point of never discussing Muggle affairs whenever Draco was in earshot, especially with Draco's father nearby. Tonight, though, the conversation had turned back to the old legend of the Philosopher's Stone. The Philosopher's Stone? Harry echoed, leaning forward. Draco glanced between Harry and Ron. According to Dumbledore's plan, even if the stone hadn't been stolen that night, he intended to destroy it right in front of Voldemort. That way, no one would ever come hunting Hogwarts for it again. Harry's eyes unfocused as he remembered. Nicholas Flamel and his wife lived long enough. They only brewed the elixirs to prepare for the afterlife. He sighed. I wonder, did Dumbledore lie to us, or did Flamel? Draco's voice dropped conspiratorially. Perhaps both. Think about it. Flamel must be utterly weary of immortality, tired of living forever as Nicholas Flamel. I wouldn't be surprised if he's mastered the elixir recipe without the stone, or even stashed away an extra stone. With Dumbledore's seal of approval, greatest wizard of our age and all, everyone believes Flamel is dead and the stone destroyed. Now he's free to vanish, change his name, and start a new life with his wife. Ron frowned, then nodded slowly. You know, that actually makes sense. Harry exchanged a look with him, then turned back to Draco. For the first time, Draco's theory didn't sound like mere speculation. It sounded like the simple truth. I don't believe Dumbledore was lying or that he was deceived, Harry said quietly. Ron might have noticed this too, he continued. Over Christmas, I met with Professor Dumbledore in front of the Mirror of Erised. He spoke a lot of profound things, so many that I can't repeat them all, but one line stays with me. Death is simply the next great adventure. Harry paused, searching Draco's face. To me, that means Dumbledore understood exactly how the mirror worked. He planned our trip into the Forbidden Forest and even left you a message, just in case. Draco frowned, folding his arms. And you mentioned that you and Hagrid went after the Philosopher's Stone together? I did, Harry confirmed. Hagrid's great at talking things through when he wants to reassure you. He's told you more than once that everything was under Dumbledore's control. A flicker of anger, and something darker passed over Draco's features. But what if he fails? What if that mysterious man kills Dumbledore? Ron flopped into a worn armchair in the Gryffindor common room, exhaling a long sigh. Honestly, an incomplete you-know-who using Quirrell as a host, there's no way he can stand up to Harry. Draco Malfoy, lounging on the opposite sofa, snorted. And that whole unbreakable vow conspiracy? A load of rubbish. It was just a convenient excuse. Dumbledore popped up at exactly the right moment. No surprise there. He's been pulling strings from the shadows all along. Exactly, Ron agreed, leaning forward. Combine that with what the mysterious young Gwump man told us, and everything we've learned about the Mirror of Erised, and it's clear. The only person who can claim the Philosopher's Stone is someone who knows of it but genuinely refuses to take it. Plus, any brain block jinx or confundus charm is useless against the protections that guard the stone, Harry added soberly. Voldemort boasted about mastering only that sort of mental interference, no deeper enchantments. Draco and Ron exchanged glances. So if we just sit tight, Draco asked, the stone stays safe? Harry nodded. Dumbledore may never be as flashy as my dad might have been, but he's hardly outmatched. He's crafted every layer of protection with care. A red-headed third year poked her head in. Harry, don't forget, Saturday's the final Quidditch match of the season. You'd better start practicing tomorrow. Harry forced a grin. Right, Quidditch. He leaned back, feeling the weight of looming challenges ease ever so slightly. With Dumbledore's safeguards in place, it seemed for once there was room to breathe. It was nearly 10 o'clock when Professor Dumbledore glanced at the ornate clock beside his desk. My friends, I'm afraid I must reclaim my office for the night, he said with a twinkle in his eye. Please do make your way back to your quarters. The professors murmured their farewells and began to rise. At the doorway, Ron paused to offer Dumbledore a final nod of respect before slipping out into the silent corridor. No sooner had the door closed than Hogwarts' 8th floor headmaster's office sprang to life. Minerva McGonagall, Severus Snape, Phileas Flitwick, and even Pomona Sprout, who rarely left her greenhouses, crowded around the object on Dumbledore's desk, a perfectly spherical stone, glowing deep crimson in the lamplight. On the walls, the painted portraits of former headmasters leaned forward eagerly, as if they, too, wanted a closer look. Is that the Philosopher's Stone? Professor Flitwick asked, perching atop a levitated stool so he could see over his colleagues. He reached out a trembling finger. Just imagine the cures one might concoct. Dragonpox, galloping gut, you name it. From a frame to his left came a startled exclamation. A silver-haired witch with gentle eyes stirred in her portrait. If I had it, she said, I could eradicate half the ailments in Wizarding Britain. It was Delis Devanti, former healer at St. Mungo's Hospital for Magical Maladies and Injuries. High above them, in the portrait nearest the ceiling, a gaunt, yellow-faced wizard with a severe fringe of black hair spoke up. Delis, with the elixir of life on tap, why trouble yourself with trifling diseases? You're letting your enthusiasm get the better of you. Delis bristled and shot him an incredulous look. Evra, you, she snapped, surprised, and just a little offended that her old headmaster and neighbor in the portraits would chide her so publicly. 4 professors fell silent, their eyes fixed on the glowing red stone at the center of the table. Pay attention, called a frail, silver-haired wizard from the back. Has no one noticed that everyone else has stopped talking? Thank you, Armando, said Dumbledore, his bright blue eyes flicking toward his elderly predecessor. You're welcome, Albus, replied Armando Dippet with a gentle nod. After all, it's our duty to support the current headmaster. Must you point that out every time? Grumbled Phineas Nigellus, the notoriously unpopular headmaster, tugging at his goatee. Dumbledore rapped the table lightly. All right, quiet, please. Instantly, the 4 deans assembled around him fell completely still. Moments passed before Snape cleared his throat. Well, aren't you going to destroy it? Isn't that the plan? Professor McGonagall pursed her lips. Professor Sprout, gloved hands smeared with mud, lost her grip on the gloves, which tumbled to the floor. Professor Flitwick gasped so sharply that he nearly toppled from his chair. All around them, the portraits of former headmasters and headmistresses exchanged knowing looks. Dumbledore leaned forward, eyes never leaving the stone. I never asked you to witness the destruction of the Philosopher's Stone, he said softly. Because this, he tapped the smooth surface of the gem, is not the Philosopher's Stone at all. Even Voldemort himself was fooled by it, Dumbledore said, his eyes dancing with that familiar, inscrutable gleam. Professor McGonagall drew in a sharp breath and took a cautious step back. When did the you-know-who arrive at Hogwarts? She hissed, voice taut with urgency. And where is Professor Quirrell? Chapter 202. The Scent of Gunpowder in the Room. Professor Minerva McGonagall stood in the doorway of the headmaster's office on Hogwarts' 8th floor, her emerald eyes widening in disbelief. A faint, acrid tang, gunpowder hung in the air, an inconceivable presence in the sanctity of these ancient walls. For years, she had believed Hogwarts to be the safest place in the wizarding world, the very heart of magical learning. Yet somehow, Lord Voldemort had found his way inside. She pressed a hand to her chest, fighting for steady breath. Albus Dumbledore, her champion, her hero, she had always been convinced possessed depths of magic even the Dark Lord could not fathom. The one thing that separated him from Voldemort, in her mind, was his nobility and his refusal to unleash his full power. She could not accept the notion that Voldemort had breached Hogwarts' defenses while Dumbledore stood oblivious or, worse, helpless. At her side, Professor Sprout placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "We'll get to the bottom of this, Minerva," she murmured, her voice calm but laced with concern. In the corner, Professor Flitwick wobbled in his armchair before toppling to the floor with a tiny squeak, only to spring right back up, dusting off his robes as though gravity were merely a suggestion. Meanwhile, Professor Snape stood motionless by the desk, his dark eyes glinting with a secretive intensity. He said nothing, yet his composed silence spoke volumes. Unable to keep the words held inside, McGonagall finally whispered, "How could Voldemort have come in? Through every known barrier, through every enchantment, he shouldn't have been able to pass." Sprout exchanged a worried look with Flitwick. "There must be a loophole, a new spell, or an overlooked weakness," the herbology professor suggested. "We'll send word to the Order at once." Flitwick adjusted his spectacles. "Indeed, and we must scour every inch of the castle for signs of him." Snape's gaze flicked toward the empty space behind the desk, as though expecting the headmaster himself to appear and explain. At last he spoke in his low, measured tone. "We should consider every possibility. This may involve dark arts we have yet to encounter." McGonagall drew a steadying breath, steeling herself against the fear that threatened to rise in her throat. "Then let us pray we uncover this secret before it's too late." She fell silent, her mind racing with questions she dared not voice aloud. "Remarkable," Dumbledore murmured, more to himself than to the assembled professors. "A truly ingenious alchemical stratagem, able to blind Voldemort's eyes and deceive even us." Professor McGonagall's reply snapped through the air. "If your alchemy is so flawless, why didn't it stop him from entering Hogwarts?" She sounded half impressed, half infuriated, and was so rattled she nearly let a harsher epithet slip. Flitwick stepped forward, voice trembling with worry. "And what of Quirrell? Do you truly believe he'll survive this?" As Ravenclaw's dean, he had always taken a personal interest in the defense against the dark arts professor. The very idea of Quirrell endangered set his nerves on edge. Dumbledore's shoulders sagged. "I feared this outcome." McGonagall drew a sharp breath, her disappointment plain in her eyes. "Voldemort, you allowed him into Hogwarts. How could you?" Suppressing his own dismay, Flitwick pressed on. "Surely you're not suggesting that Quirrell himself aided Voldemort's entry?" From the fireplace came a chuckle. The portrait of Phineas Nigellus wagged his finger in mock reproach. "There you have it, Albus," he observed slyly. "This is exactly why teaching is so thankless. Young wizards these days always think they know best." In the hushed stillness of his office, Albus Dumbledore regarded the portrait of Phineas Nigellus with mild amusement. The long-dead headmaster's painted lips curled into a sneer. "Poor, conceited little wizards," Phineas began, his voice dripping with disdain. "Have you never wondered why the real headmaster of Hogwarts keeps so many details of his plan to himself? Whenever you think you're wronged, you never pause to obey Dumbledore's orders. Has it ever harmed you? Of course not. Like all youth, you fancy only you have insight, only you can perceive danger or divine the Dark Lord's schemes." "That's quite enough, Phineas," Dumbledore said quietly, raising a finger to forestall further reproach. "One more word from you, and I fear your little gray cells might explode under the strain of thought." Phineas's painted eyelids fluttered closed in dramatic fashion. "At this rate," he muttered half asleep, "I reckon I'll go down in history as the least popular headmaster Hogwarts ever had." Dumbledore chuckled, the sound soft as a breeze through treetops. "It's fortunate, then, that Severus Snape, potions master and head of Slytherin, is proving quite resourceful during these troubled times." He swept his gaze around the room. "In fact, there are many more surprises yet to be shared with the staff." His eyes twinkled as they settled on the portrait of Professor McGonagall. She stiffened at being addressed so informally, as if she were once again a first year. Dumbledore's grin widened. "Minerva, I assure you, I shan't let you off the hook entirely." The ancient portraits murmured among themselves, but Dumbledore simply sat back, calm and unruffled. Dark times lay ahead, and if even his own former headmasters quibbled and feigned sleep, so much the better. It kept everyone alert. For in secrets, as he well knew, lay the best defense against the darkness gathering at Hogwarts gates. Snape's eyes blazed as he stared at Dumbledore, silent fury radiating from every line of his face. Flitwick and Sprout exchanged uneasy glances, waiting for the headmaster to speak. Finally, Dumbledore cleared his throat. "I suppose I ought to begin last summer," he said. "Nick Flamel came to me in fear, though he was hardly afraid, telling me someone was after the Philosopher's Stone. He knew the dangers and was prepared to die alongside the woman he loved to protect it. In the old alchemical texts, that kind of devotion isn't surprising. Thankfully, I sent Hagrid ahead to secure the stone before the thief could reach it. You're all familiar with those events. What you're not familiar with is who stole it." A tense hush fell over the room. Snape's hand twitched. Flitwick's eyebrows shot up. Sprout's lips pressed into a thin line. "It was Lord Voldemort," Dumbledore said quietly. "And there's more you need to know. Professor Quirrell's odd behavior, his constant fidgeting, his nervous glances in my direction. That wasn't mere anxiety. He was trying to draw me in, hoping I could save him, but I couldn't. Only he could save himself." McGonagall's voice was sharp as she stepped forward. "You couldn't? Even you?" Dumbledore bowed his head. "No, it wasn't merely Quirrell I was facing. Lord Voldemort was hidden on the back of his head." "Perhaps he regretted it later," Dumbledore began, his voice heavy, "but Quirrell did willingly surrender both his body and his mind to Voldemort. He's gone too far now for anyone else to save him. He must abandon his grand ambitions and expel the Dark Lord from within himself." Professor McGonagall exchanged a worried glance with him. Dumbledore went on, "I still cling to a glimmer of hope for Quirrell. After Harry floored him twice in the chamber, I seized the chance to get close, his best and only opportunity to break free from Voldemort's control." McGonagall's eyes glistened. "But as we all know, it went terribly wrong. Under Voldemort's sway, Quirrell released the troll at the Halloween feast to divert our attention. Then, driven even deeper by the Dark Lord, he caused the death of an innocent unicorn." Dumbledore sighed. "I never expected him to collapse so swiftly. Voldemort and I both understand the stakes. He knows I've discovered him, and he knows I moved because Quirrell's life hangs in the balance." He offered McGonagall a tired smile. "You did everything you could. No students were harmed." McGonagall brushed away a tea. That poor boy," she whispered. "He fell victim to a classic Ravenclaw flaw. His hunger for knowledge outpaced his judgment." Professor Flitwick scrambled up onto a chair, peering down at the assembled staff. "The younger a genius is, the more prone he becomes to Slytherin-style ambition." A heavy silence fell. Professor Sprout let out a long, exasperated sigh. Snape sat off to one side, lips compressed into a straight line, refusing to offer even a murmur of support. Only McGonagall looked ready to burst. Flitwick pressed on. "If none of this ever happened in class, then why have Mr. Potter and his friends twice faced Voldemort himself?" "Neither encounter occurred during a lesson," Snape drawled coolly. "One took place in the Forbidden Forest, the other in the restricted section on the 4th floor." "That's exactly my point," Sprout snapped. She rounded on Dumbledore. "Albus, why did you personally send for Potter and company that night? Why encourage them to traipse into the Forbidden Forest over what was, frankly, a trivial matter?" Professor McGonagall slammed her hand against the table so hard her quill rattled. "And why were they skulking about the astronomy tower at midnight? Again, on your instructions." Dumbledore, calm, serene, rose from his chair. He held up a hand, parrying their accusations with a kindly smile. "Minerva, Pomona, Phileas, please, let's hear one another out." Flitwick and Sprout exchanged worried looks, while Snape raised an eyebrow, but remained silent. Even McGonagall's ire dampened slightly at Dumbledore's gentle appeal. "Yes," Dumbledore conceded, "I did ask Harry to investigate unusual disturbances that threatened the school. I believed his courage and his friend's loyalty might prevent something far worse than a midnight jaunt. It was, admittedly, a risk." Sprout folded her arms. "A risk that had them dueling you-know-who." Dumbledore dipped his head. "I know, but sometimes the greatest dangers lead us to the greatest protections. I accept responsibility for putting them in harm's way. Let us now focus on ensuring they never have to face that horror again." Flitwick stepped down from his perch, smoothing his robes. "Very well, Headmaster, but next time, perhaps we involve some of us equally concerned staff before unleashing teenage heroes." McGonagall gave a single, relieved nod. Snape said at last in his low voice, "If you'll pardon my saying so, Albus, some decisions are best made in consultation." Dumbledore smiled, eyes gleaming behind half-moon spectacles. Agreed. From now on, we stand together, teachers and students alike, against any threat to Hogwarts. Just as Dumbledore had anticipated, Professor McGonagall slipped her wand back into her robes and chose to hear his explanation before taking any further action. Chapter 203, The Scene, presented to everyone. In that moment, the atmosphere in the headmaster's office on the 8th floor was electric with tension. Every professor present respected and trusted Albus Dumbledore without question, yet even they recoiled at the thought of sending underage students into direct confrontation with Lord Voldemort. They'd all sensed Voldemort's presence tied to Professor Quirrell in class, but they'd chosen to trust that Dumbledore's arrangement contained hidden safeguards. After all, by merely setting foot in Hogwarts, each young witch and wizard had effectively entered a magical contract guaranteeing their safety within its walls and classrooms, a contract none of them were willing to challenge. Even during the infamous troll attack, the faculty had never truly feared for the students' lives. At worst, a few bruised ribs. That was why Minerva McGonagall's first impulse had been to scold Harry and his friends for causing chaos, rather than to worry they might have faced mortal danger. Until now, Dumbledore's judgment had gone unquestioned. But as the reality of today's events settled over them, even the staunchest defenders of the headmaster found themselves silently wondering whether they'd all been too trusting. The moment Dumbledore mentioned the Forbidden Forest and the off-limits 4th-floor corridor, every professor in the room froze. By Hogwarts contract, neither area was supposed to be entered by staff under any circumstances. They all turned to the headmaster, waiting for him to explain. "Very well," Dumbledore began softly. "Their late-night excursion to the astronomy tower does indeed involve me. I won't speak ill of another's reputation. Let us leave Severus's methods unmentioned. But the truth behind the unicorn's death is that I was trailing Harry and his friends to keep them safe. In my distraction, I failed to notice what I was walking into. I followed them even into that forbidden corridor on the 4th floor." He paused, letting the weight of his confession settle over them. At last, Minerva McGonagall spoke. "I can accept that," she said quietly. "With you watching over them, even if you know who were at the height of his power, I wouldn't fear for Harry and the others in a direct confrontation." Dumbledore inclined his head in acknowledgement. "Nevertheless, I did not summon you here tonight to discuss my oversights." He stepped closer to the low table at the center of the room, where a small stone rested on a velvet cushion. Its dull surface caught the candlelight and seemed to glow from within. "Tonight's true matter of concern," he said, voice low and steady, "is this stone. You believed it to be the Philosopher's Stone." McGonagall drew herself up, her eyes sharp. "What are you telling us, Albus?" For the first time that evening, a faint smile curved Dumbledore's lips. "Sharp as ever, Minerva, but there is no Philosopher's Stone here. It was a forgery, an elaborate fake." A murmur ran through the assembled professors. McGonagall shook her head in disbelief. "Albus, surely you're not trying to frighten us all over again." But Dumbledore's calm gaze offered no reassurance. The silence that followed was heavy with questions, none of which he seemed in any hurry to answer. "If you know who really did steal the Philosopher's Stone, are you going to just tell us all that?" Professor McGonagall snapped, waving her hand as if to ward off any further nonsense. "Albus would never lie," Professor Flitwick replied, tapping his wand thoughtfully against his chin. "It must be some trick of words." "Or," McGonagall ventured, "the stone was destroyed by Dumbledore himself, hence its disappearance." "Perhaps," Severus Snape drawled, eyes fixed on Dumbledore, "the stone was never meant for its legendary powers at all, but as a decoy for you-know-who, maybe even to record everything around it." Dumbledore's eyes twinkled. "Congratulations, Severus. You're almost there." With that, he raised his wand and pointed it at the small crimson gem resting on the table. At once, portraits along the walls leaned forward, their painted heads tilting in eager anticipation. Then, hovering above the stone, an image formed, an ethereal projection that held every wizard and witch in rapt silence. Out of the moonlight stepped a young man, his features so arrestingly handsome that even the seasoned professors dared not speak. The ghostly figure stood there, silver light dancing on his hair, and for a moment the great hall was utterly still. Professor McGonagall finally lost her patience the moment the projection showed the mysterious young man approaching her line of defense. Nearby, Dumbledore stood studying the enchanted stone. He tapped it lightly with his wand, and the image froze just as the youth stepped into the giant chessboard chamber. "If I'm not mistaken," Dumbledore said with a wry smile, "your security here is remarkably straightforward." He turned to Pomona Sprout. "Especially yours, Pomona. Any wizard who can cast Lumos would breeze right through these wards." McGonagall's nostrils flared, and her eyes narrowed. "Am I the only one taking this seriously?" she snapped. "We don't know what defenses the others have put in place, or how far they've gone to protect their stones. Yet here you are, Albus, clearly treating this like child's play. Besides, the earlier guards seem to be nothing more than Fred and George messily disguised." Professor Sprout gave a half-shrug. "Honestly, when it's Dumbledore's own protections, I figure there's no need to overthink it. If he lets someone pass, there must be a reason, right?" She managed a placating smile, but McGonagall was far from reassured. Professor Pomona Sprout's voice cut through the hurried murmurs in the staff room. "You're all missing the real point," she snapped, arms folded. "Did you see what he did with magic? Without even raising a wand, the devil's snare we erected mended itself. One simple command, and he sent the three-headed hound into a stupor. He didn't act like any witch or wizard I've ever seen, and then, with a single swipe of a razor-sharp blade, he severed every key from its chain." Professor Phileas Flitwick straightened in his seat, his expression earnest. "But," McGonagall's cool green eyes snapped toward him, "Phileas, your so-called defenses are nothing more than parlor tricks. A well-aimed freezing charm could immobilize the keys without damaging them, or a truly gifted flyer, the sort we have in our Quidditch squads, could outmaneuver any intruder. I dare say I myself could have intercepted him mid-air." Flitwick's shoulders rose and fell in a small shrug. "Minerva, I must respectfully disagree with Pomona's assessment. Dumbledore himself approved my enchantments. If they were so feeble, he wouldn't have given them the go-ahead." Sprout gave a tight nod. "Albus will want to speak to us all in person. He'll want answers, especially about how quickly our safeguards were dismantled." Flitwick leaned forward, hands clasped. "From my understanding, these measures were never intended to be impenetrable. Their sole purpose was to delay an intruder long enough for the rest of us, Dumbledore, Hagrid, whoever, to arrive on the scene." McGonagall tapped her fingers on the table. "Delay or not, we need something more robust. Today's breach was far too effortless. Tomorrow, it could be worse." Sprout exhaled, smoothing the edge of her robes. "Agreed. We'll confer with Dumbledore, then reconvene. It's time we devised a line of defense even the most unorthodox adversary couldn't slip through." The three professors exchanged determined glances. In the hush that followed, the only certainty was that nothing short of a complete overhaul would keep Hogwarts safe from whatever, or whoever, had just shown them how vulnerable they truly were. Professor Snape waved Professor McGonagall aside. "Don't look at me now. My defensive ward is extremely volatile. You'll see it soon enough," he said, motioning to Dumbledore to resume the projection. The spectral image flickered back to life between them. From its depths came a pout of contempt. "What good is a half-hearted defense that only serves to please your superiors?" the hooded figure sneered. Minerva McGonagall folded her arms, muttering, "No rules, no order." When the demonstration ended, they followed Snape down the corridor to his private chambers. The echo of that challenge still crackled in the air. Snape turned sharply. "My poisons and conjured flames carry a real risk of death. Far deadlier than anything McGonagall teaches." The hooded youth's projected voice shot back. Professor Flitwick hurried forward. "Severus, please, there's no need for anger. We're all working toward the same goal." Snape's dark eyes blazed. "No, we are not the same." Minerva interjected, coolly precise. "Your methods may be unorthodox, Severus, but they are as vital as any we employ." He snorted. "Professor Sprout is lauded for her gentleness. You're praised for your discipline, Minerva. A mere warning is all he received. What about me?" Snape whirled to face Dumbledore. The headmaster offered a gentle smile. "Severus, your creativity outshines caution every time." "Better than that tiresome Bigelow?" Snape snapped. "At least I'm not tasteless," he added darkly. Dumbledore's expression softened into a sigh. Severus, this isn't like you. In the hush that followed, the four teachers, each brilliant in their own right, stood reminded that, despite their differences, they were bound together by the same urgent cause. If it were the old you wouldn't give it a second thought. You'd breeze right through, Dumbledore said, his curiosity piqued. Snape's eyes glittered with irritation. He'd never cared what anyone else thought. If he ever became headmaster, he'd outdo even Phineas Nigellus in being insufferable. Meanwhile, in the Ravenclaw dormitory, Ryan quietly kept his accomplishments to himself, determined not to draw attention. Snape's snarl still echoed as the hovering projection reached the moment when the false philosopher's stone was inserted, and then it abruptly shut off. Dumbledore turned to the other three professors. Aside from his assessment, what else did you observe? Chapter 204, People's Speculations. What is a wizard, really? Ask 10 people and you'll get 10 different answers. Among Muggles, cultural traditions have shaped wildly divergent images. In some places, wizards are charlatans who pass themselves off as gods, offering prayers and blessings for a price. Elsewhere, they're seen as oracles, fortune-tellers who read tarot cards and divine the future. In yet other regions, a wizard is a gifted protector, using magic to shield communities from natural disasters, hostile invaders, or supernatural threats. They set wrongs right, weigh justice, command the forces of nature, and explain the world's most terrifying mysteries. Despite these grand reputations, the most powerful wizards remain, as Professor McGonagall often reminds her students, merely humans with extraordinary gifts. With a flick of their wands, they can reshape an object's form and appearance or alter its very essence. The most skilled among them can brew life-extending potions or reawaken long-dormant magical artifacts. Yet for all their talents, wizards are as fragile as any mortal soul. They must learn to harness magic. It does not flow through them instinctively as it does in dragons, unicorns, or other magical beings. Spells almost always demand three things: the right words, the proper wand movement, and a clear intent. Use only gestures or only incantations, and the resulting magic is barely more than a spark. Consider the wizards of the Ouagadougou school in Africa. They excel at animagus transformations, but they reserve gesture-only magic for life-or-death situations or stealthy ambushes. Even Hogwarts' famed silent spells, taught in 5th year, aren't truly wand-free. A wand, after all, is made of potent magical substances and retains echoes of every enchantment it channels. It remains an indispensable focus, a sort of catalyst that lets a caster become, in effect, a living conduit for magic. With that in mind, the four heads of house in Dumbledore's office reached a startling conclusion. The mysterious young man in the portrait was not a wizard in the conventional sense at all, but something far stranger, a humanoid magical creature. Silence fell over the room as they struggled to find the right words for the headmaster's question. Wandless spellcasting is far too difficult for our British wizards, and it's simply unthinkable to use reliably in combat, Professor McGonagall said, her tone grave. Yet this self-proclaimed magician, through nothing more than his words and gestures, has managed feats of magic on par with our finest wand work. She paused, gathering her thoughts. What's more, his body appears to have undergone a transformation by some extremely rare and dangerous magic. To accomplish such a change without altering his outward appearance, that defies everything we know about transfiguration. As head of Transfiguration, McGonagall was uniquely qualified to make that judgment. No one in the current magical community had demonstrated such mastery, especially not a seamless, undetectable metamorphosis. Professor Sprout, nodding in agreement, added, "Devil's Snare. We introduce it in first-year herbology." She thumbed through her notes. Textbooks and lectures describe it as a rare, perilous plant, but one that's surprisingly straightforward to manage when you know the proper techniques. Just a few moments of sunlight is all it takes to keep Devil's Snare from tightening its deadly coils, Professor Sprout explained, eyeing the nervous students. Yet you might be surprised to learn that this feared plant is also one of the most common and most taught species in herbology. She tapped the pot at her feet. Devil's Snare appears frequently in our curriculum because it's easy to cultivate under controlled conditions and straightforward to handle, so long as you remember the golden rule: light is life. Deny it sunlight, and it will drag you down. Expose it for even a few seconds, and it will recoil. A student raised a hand. But Professor, you just said it's rare? Indeed, she nodded. In the wild, devil's snare only grows in pitch-black, damp caves and underground tunnels, places sunlight never reaches. That scarcity in nature makes it rare, yet thanks to magical propagation, we keep ample samples in our greenhouse. She turned to the young man who had spoken earlier. You referred to the moon as your only exposure to this plant. That tells me you hail from a very isolated environment, where the term moonlight might mean something entirely different. The student blinked. Sir? Sprout smiled warmly. I meant the vast desert, of course. In those sun-blasted wastes, you'd never stumble upon genuine devil's snare. That's what makes your insight so intriguing. You speak of using it in bright daylight, even under the moon. Why not let your imagination roam? If you can picture this creature flourishing in the desert, then perhaps devil's snare truly does lurk in unexpected places, waiting to be discovered by those bold enough to seek it. With that, she gestured for them to gather around as the greenhouse lights dimmed, leaving only a narrow beam of illumination over the writhing tendrils, proof that sometimes all it takes to control a monster is the spark of an idea and a little sunlight. Could he really have come from the moon? Professor Flitwick asked quietly, glancing around the staff table. His method of spellcasting, he continued, and the precision with which he performs them don't correspond to any of the magical schools we know. Such mastery couldn't spring from a single family's tradition or one person's invention. He tapped his wand thoughtfully on the table. He must hail from a place outside our entire wizarding world, somewhere no witch or wizard has ever ventured. Perhaps the moon. Unseen by Flitwick, Ryan had deliberately adopted this bespoke style of magic, a personal plug-in developed from scratch to match his strengths. Now, at almost 7th-level proficiency, he could easily mislead even the brightest minds. That was precisely his plan. Drop tantalizing clues so observers like Flitwick and Dumbledore would reach the conclusions he wanted. As Flitwick voiced his conjecture, the other professors exchanged thoughtful looks. Finally, Dumbledore inclined his head. It is not beyond the realm of possibility, he admitted. You know I spend my off-duty time in Spinner's End, and I've read Muggle accounts of the Americans' rocket landing on the moon. We've always attributed it to Muggle science, but perhaps there were magical collaborators behind that venture. Professor McGonagall hummed in agreement. If, indeed, a wizarding contingent assisted them, it would explain the seamless success of their mission. Flitwick nodded, eyes bright. So, if Ryan's origins lie on the lunar surface, we must prepare ourselves for truths that surpass even our most daring imaginations. In that moment, the staff realized they were on the cusp of discovering a hidden chapter of wizarding history, one that stretched all the way to Earth's silent satellite. Snape's dark eyes narrowed. That ridiculous fellow calling himself a magician, he might very well be one of those American wizards who landed on the moon. Dumbledore's pale face broke into an approving smile. Excellent deduction, Severus. That's precisely what occurred to me. He shifted his gaze to the stranger standing across the room. Then tell me, who are you? Severus gave a snort of impatience. Isn't that exactly why you asked us both to come here tonight, Albus? Dumbledore waved a hand in mock humility. Ah, consider this merely an appetizer. You may well know things that this poor old wizard does not. He opened his mouth to continue, but before a single word could leave it, the sorcerer's stone, silent until then, burned to life once more. All eyes turned to the glowing gem as a new vision unfolded within it. A phoenix, brilliant and fiery, materialized from the void, its plumage shimmering with reds and golds. It swooped down and perched upon the back of Professor Quirrell's head. In that instant, black, crackling flames erupted, and Harry Potter himself appeared at the center of the inferno. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the spectacle vanished, and Quirrell collapsed, his body hitting the floor with a hollow thud. Professor McGonagall gasped, her sharp features creasing in surprise. Albus, is that truly you? She looked to Dumbledore, astonished. After he'd mentioned tracking Harry and his companions, she'd assumed the mysterious sorcerer and the Quirrell under his control had already been dealt with. Clearly, there was far more at work here than anyone had anticipated. Professor McGonagall's heart sank as Dumbledore's impatience flared. He stepped forward so abruptly that Harry never got the chance to question Quirrell or the hooded stranger about their intentions. Yet the mysterious man was far from beaten. A low hum of power still vibrated around him, echoing the force of their collision. Suddenly, Professor Flitwick's voice rang out, sharp with astonishment. "Wait! It's Harry Potter!" McGonagall and Sprout exchanged alarmed glances, utterly speechless. In the back of the room, Snape leaned forward, his dark eyes alight with eagerness. Finally, he would see what he'd missed. Dumbledore paused, his gaze fixed on Harry. After a moment, he nodded, half in relief and half in disbelief. "Yes, it truly is Harry." He smoothed his robes and cleared his throat, as if embarrassed by his own haste. He had come to speak of Sirius, not to witness the Sorcerer's Stone itself unveil Harry's identity so dramatically. Yet here they all stood, the school's greatest minds gathered, stunned by a revelation none of them had expected. Chapter 205 Mad Snape. After Harry's victory over the troll, whispers began to spread through Hogwarts that perhaps he'd carried immense power ever since he was an infant, enough even to rival Voldemort. Professor McGonagall, who had watched Dumbledore personally hand the baby Harry to the Dursleys, mused to herself that maybe the headmaster's real intention was to hide this terrifying gift in a Muggle household, preventing it from warping the boy's mind too early. Yet no one among them could have foreseen how quickly Harry would topple Professor Quirrell this year, nor how frightened even Voldemort himself had looked. Now, almost 11 years later, Harry Potter had done it again. He had bested the Dark Lord. "I still can't believe Quirrell collapsed that easily," Professor Sprout said, frowning. "Last time, he survived, and, after you confided the truth to us, Albus, I honestly thought he'd been holding back, playing possum." McGonagall shook her head, but he wasn't hiding. Harry's spells struck him full force. Sprout tapped her notes. "What puzzles me is this. The body Quirrell wore remained behind, but the other presence was expelled entirely by Harry's magic." Dumbledore sighed, his shoulders heavy with regret. "Alas, the Dark Lord chose to sacrifice Quirrell's life in order to flee. He never hesitates to use others as pawns in his flight for survival." A heavy silence fell over the room. Even 11 years on, the wizarding world still reeled from the echo of Harry's triumph, and from the somber cost at which it had come. After a moment's hesitation, grief still fresh in his heart, Professor Flitwick's curiosity took over. He couldn't stop wondering which spell Harry had used to call forth a phoenix. "I never imagined Harry could summon a phoenix," he murmured, eyes wide beneath his bushy eyebrows. Then he spotted something else. "And look at that, red sparks." Floating above Harry's outstretched palm, those tiny crimson embers revealed the true complexity of the charm, far more intricate than the simple firework jinx it first appeared to be. Around him, the assembled professors exchanged impressed glances, their shock giving way to fascination as they watched the duel unfold. Exactly then, Voldemort's cold voice rang out across the courtyard, delivering a confession that stunned everyone. He, too, was a half-blood wizard, just like Harry. Professor McGonagall drew in a sharp breath. "I never realized he was half-blood, nor that he'd been a student here," she said, her voice tinged with disbelief. "He may very well have been the finest student in Hogwarts' history." Dumbledore looked on, sadness clouding his eyes. "Few remember that his birth name was Tom Riddle," he said softly. 50 years ago, when I was teaching Transfiguration, he was one of my brightest pupils. Then he vanished after graduation, traveling the world, leaving only rumors and rumors of dark deeds in his wake." Professor McGonagall stared in stunned silence at the shimmering tableau hovering above Dumbledore's desk. There, in ghostly relief, was a man, bent and pallid, eyes red with malice, surrounded by arcane runes and writhing shadows. The caption that glowed beneath him read, "Tom Marvolo Riddle." To every witch and wizard present it was unmistakable. After plunging ever deeper into forbidden arts and fraternizing with the darkest figures in the magical underworld, the once handsome, brilliant student union president had undergone horrendous transformations and re-emerged as Lord Voldemort. None but a few astute observers would ever have linked him to the charming young man they'd known. "It can't be," McGonagall murmured, her voice betraying her shock. Snape's face remained impassive, though his eyes flickered with something like admiration. Dumbledore offered no further explanation, only a faint, distant smile played on his lips. Before anyone could ask what came next, a new name flickered into view beneath the frozen image: Grindelwald. Gasps rippled around the room. Grindelwald, the first Dark Lord? Breathed Flitwick. Albus, Wispay, Red Sprout, brow furrowed. Dumbledore inclined his head, eyes never leaving the vision. Yes, he said quietly, that Grindelwald. His smile deepened, as if tethered to memories too vast for him to share. For a long moment, the professors remained rooted to the spot, studying the spellbound portrait. Then, without warning, the entire scene stilled, suspended in midair like a half-remembered dream. Silence settled over the chamber, heavy with questions that only Dumbledore could answer. Dumbledore frowned, his fingers tracing the last of the protective runes he'd woven around the Philosopher's Stone. "I've just finished a thorough sweep," he said, his voice low but carrying across the hushed room. "Every charm confirms the stone itself remains untampered. Yet there's one detail I haven't quite nailed down, until now." He raised his wand, and a pale, flickering image shimmered into view above the center table. "Observe," he instructed. "This projection only plays when someone is watching. The instant all eyes shift away, it pauses, and after a time, it will shut itself off entirely." Professor Snape's dark gaze narrowed. "So it conserves its magic unless it has an audience," he deduced crisply. The other professors leaned forward. Even the portraits on the walls, long-dead wizards and witches, tilted in their frames as though straining to see. The scene unfolded. A dimly lit chamber, Lord Voldemort's skeletal form whispering to a younger Harry Potter. "Grindelwald," Voldemort hissed, the name dripping with contempt. "Stand with me. Swear this unbreakable vow." A collective exhale rippled through the onlookers. Dumbledore had warned them of the outcome. The stone hidden in the mirror would prove to be a decoy, and Voldemort would vanish the moment Quirrell tried to claim it. Yet none could tear their eyes away. Suddenly, the vision shifted. Harry's hand dove into his pocket. For an instant, the real Philosopher's Stone gleamed there, so bright it hurt to look. Voldemort's crimson eyes snapped to it, wide with shock. "You," he rasped, voice low and urgent. "How did you—" Professor Snape's lips curved into a subtle, almost predatory smile as he turned to Dumbledore. "We all understand the Mirror of Erised's principle," he said, voice edged with triumph. "But why? Why would the true stone be so determined to end up in Harry Potter's pocket?" Professor McGonagall frowned as the enchanted image hovered above Dumbledore's desk, replaying itself in an endless loop. "Yes, Albus," Professor Sprout murmured, her voice gentle enough to betray her agreement. "What if—" McGonagall cut in, leaning forward. "This really is the Philosopher's Stone," and Harry, not realizing its worth, simply tossed it aside. A hush fell over the room. Every professor turned to Dumbledore, their eyes wide with unspoken concern. The headmaster only managed an awkward, apologetic smile. He hadn't expected McGonagall's question, nor its bluntness. With a slight shake of his head, he let his gaze settle back on the floating scene as though nothing unusual had happened. Allowing the silent footage to continue, moments later, the professor's anxiety over the stone was forgotten. The image shifted, and Voldemort's cold voice crackled through the air. "Sirius Black is innocent." "Don't tell me this is real!" Professor Snape suddenly roared, startling everyone. He'd been the calmest observer. After all, he'd been there when it happened, but now his voice echoed with disbelief. Sirius Black was a name Snapey would never forget. Had James Potter never whisked Lily Evans away, had her friendship not drawn him in, Sirius would have topped Snape's enemies list. Yet here was Sirius, proclaimed innocent by Voldemort himself. None of the other professors seemed surprised by Snape's outburst. They knew all too well the enmity between the two men. Instead, they fell silent, lost in their own memories. "I still remember them," McGonagall murmured, eyes distant. Black and Potter, leaders of their inseparable trio. As the image played on, each professor revisited a past they thought long buried, wondering how that past would reshape their present. Professor Flitwick drummed his fingers thoughtfully on his desk. "Both of them are clever, undoubtedly. But I can't recall ever meeting a duo as incorrigible as Sirius Black and James Potter." Professor McGonagall inclined her head gravely. "You'd have thought they were brothers," Flitwick added, "always inseparable." "Precisely," McGonagall replied. "James Potter trusted Sirius more than anyone else. Their bond never wavered, even after graduation. When James married Lily, Sirius stood beside him as best man, and was later chosen as Harry's godfather. Flitwick let out a rueful sigh. I never for a moment believed Sirius could betray James. McGonagall's voice trembled, as though chilled to the bone. But if Peter Pettigrew was the real traitor, then an innocent man has sat in Azkaban all these years. She swallowed hard, regret shadowing her features. Over the years, she had often scolded Peter as dull and inept in charm work, sometimes even calling him foolish. Now she regretted those harsh words. Poor Peter, she murmured. He was always dreadful in duels. Why did he act on his own before the Ministry could intervene? Flitwick offered her a sympathetic nod, aware that the truth had upended everything they'd believed about loyalty, betrayal, and the friendships forged at Hogwarts. Not innocent. He's far from innocent. This can't be true, Dumbledore. Snape's voice rang with hysteria, wide-eyed and trembling. His outburst jolted the other professors, who had been quietly harboring doubts about Sirius's guilt, back into stunned silence. Dumbledore watched Severus with gentle eyes. Severus, you must believe me, he said softly. Sirius Black really is innocent. He held Snape's gaze, his expression filled with compassionate resolve. Chapter 206, Prelude to Sirius's Release from Prison. The grandfather clock in Dumbledore's office chimed 1:30 a.m., yet none of the senior staff showed a hint of sleepiness. Minerva McGonagall, Pomona Sprout, Phileas Flitwick, and, most intensely of all, Severus Snape, were locked in a furious debate over Sirius Black's innocence. Snape slammed his fist against the oak desk. What about Peter Pettigrew, the coward who murdered Lily? He demanded, eyes blazing. McGonagall exchanged a worried glance with Flitwick. Don't tell me he's dead, she whispered. If it's true, Snape shot back in a flat tone, then we've rewarded a traitor with a first-class Order of Merlin? A medal for the rat who betrayed us all? Flitwick opened his mouth to soothe him, but found no words. Sprout edged forward, concern in her eyes, only to have Snape recoil from her gentle approach. Once Voldemort is vanquished, Snape continued, voice low and steely, I'll break into Azkaban myself and end Sirius Black. Severus, McGonagall began, but she took a careful step back. Snape's fury made even a mention of Sirius dangerous. Spare me your cautions about hatred, he said, sneering. If Pettigrew lives, I'll kill him. If he's dead, then Black stands alone, with no purpose except to brood over his guilt for Harry's parents' deaths. Dumbledore, who had been listening intently from behind his desk, spoke at last. We must face an uncomfortable truth. Peter Pettigrew was indeed the secret keeper. The evidence is irrefutable. A stunned silence fell across the room. In the pale glow of the firelight, teachers and headmaster alike felt the weight of that revelation, and the turbulent road it promised ahead. That mad dog was all too eager to believe Azkaban would be his salvation, Snape sneered, a cruel grin twisting his lips as he contemplated Sirius Black's fate. Atonement? Don't be ridiculous. No, I want him fully exonerated, released, and celebrated as a martyr. Let everyone see him as a wronged hero and watch his pain haunt him forever. A tense silence fell over the faculty. No one dared interrupt. They all had questions: how to appeal Sirius's conviction, how to manage the legal proceedings once he was proven innocent, but Snape's unwavering glare kept them mute. At that moment, the portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black stirred on the wall. The ancient headmaster's eyes flickered open, and his voice, icy as ever, filled the room. Am I to understand that my great-grandson, the last scion of the Black family, is truly innocent? Dumbledore inclined his head gravely. Indeed, Phineas. But our challenge now is— No more questions, Snape cut in sharply. Whether it's veritaserum or a bit of legilimency, we have the means to prove it. We stand ready. He paused, letting his words sink in. And as for any notion of atoning for past wrongs, forget it. Phineas Nigellus's painted lips curved into a sardonic smile. Well said. You truly are a worthy Slytherin. Severus Snape offered a cool, measured smile and gave a slight nod. The more composed his expression, the more uneasy his colleagues became. Some quietly wondered whether Dumbledore had been too hasty in securing Sirius Black's release. Perhaps it would have been wiser to leave him isolated in Azkaban after all. Apart from Dumbledore himself, no one would say so aloud. On another note, Snape said, his voice low, we can now claim we've uncovered traces of Peter Pettigrew. Minerva McGonagall raised an eyebrow. But Pettigrew's escape was handled by Crouch Sr. He was arrested before term even began, and yet Fudge gained little from it. None of Crouch's underlings were implicated. I imagine the minister would leap at any chance to revisit the Mad Dog case. Snape's dark eyes glittered. Exactly. This is the very blade we need to press against the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. A well-placed nudge, and the whole affair comes back under scrutiny. At that moment, the portrait of Phineas Nigellus Black on the office wall stirred, his painted features lighting up with eager anticipation. For years, he had despaired of his family's future. Sirius, the only remaining great-grandson of the Blacks, languished in Azkaban, spelling extinction for their house. But now, at last, hope was rekindled. "Okay, Severus," McGonagall said softly, nodding. "It's a good plan." Professor Flitwick agreed, his eyes bright. Albus Dumbledore glanced at the faint image flickering inside the enchanted stone. "Why don't we continue to study this vision, and then turn our attention to the other matters at hand?" Before he could finish, Severus Snape swept into the room, his cloak swirling behind him. "Don't worry," he said in a low, assured voice. "I'll handle everything. I'm writing that letter now, and I'll show it to you before I send it." With that, he vanished as abruptly as he had appeared. As expected of a Slytherin, a sharp voice drawled from its gilded frame. Dumbledore sighed and pinched the bridge of his nose. "Silence, Phineas," he said. "You're simply jealous. The excellence of our school speaks for itself." Phineas Nigellus scowled one last time before his portrait went blank, the frame empty. "Who was that?" Professor Flitwick asked, peering at the empty frame in confusion. "That," said Dumbledore, "was Severus Snape's portrait. Much like Daly's hangs at St. Mungo's, this one remains here to speak with us when Snape cannot be present." Flitwick's brow furrowed. "I wasn't aware." "Indeed," Dumbledore interrupted gently. "Snape intends to find someone who can speak on Sirius Black's behalf, to support any petition for his release from Azkaban." Professor Flitwick's face broke into a relieved smile. He nodded eagerly. "That's exactly what I wanted to ask." Professor McGonagall frowned, glancing at Dumbledore. "Are we, like Snape, then?" she asked quietly, her voice carrying all the weight of the question. Dumbledore gave a small, helpless nod. "Let us continue," he said, and the shimmering projection before them flickered back into action. The memory resumed where it had left off, Dumbledore's private conversations with Harry, culminating in that startling confession. Though the words themselves were clipped and cautious, the professors watching could see the truth in Dumbledore's eyes. This was information he had kept hidden at great personal cost. Even Dumbledore seemed reluctant to proceed. Minerva McGonagall noted his hesitation, and she understood all too well. The more fiercely one guards a secret, the more determined others become to uncover it. The scene shifted to the climactic moment in the chamber beneath Hogwarts. Professor Quirrell stood before Dumbledore and Harry, his face torn with conflict. Summoning dark magic he could barely control, Quirrell's body exploded in a vicious burst of crimson energy. Voldemort's voice screamed in rage, and then dissolved into a swirl of black smoke, slithering away into the shadows. Silence fell over the room. Every onlooker knew Quirrell was gone, but seeing it replayed before them made it all too real. Professor Flitwick, who had been leaning forward in eager attention, toppled back in his chair, his face drained of color. He was still begging his master at the end, he cried, grief and disbelief warring in his voice. Professor Sprout, normally the gentlest of them all, covered her mouth, tears stinging her eyes. Quirrell was serving you-know-who. How could the Dark Lord? Her words trailed away, choked by sorrow. In that hushed, heavy moment, the weight of that terrible night settled over every witness. The memory faded, leaving only the echo of what had been, and the unspoken questions that remained. Professor McGonagall's voice rang out before anyone else could speak. Voldemort could have escaped without sacrificing Quirrell. She, and the others, had finally pieced together the terrible truth. Dumbledore sat to one side, nodding quietly as McGonagall spoke. At the time, even he hadn't fully appreciated what she was uncovering. Only later did he realize that Tom Riddle's Horcruxes must far exceed his previous estimates. Voldemort's power was no longer enough to contain the fractured pieces of his soul. And the magic keeping Harry alive inside Professor Quirrell was a tenuous thing indeed, a rootless thread of power that would snap unless Harry remained firmly anchored, aided by the protective blood bonds of Lily's relatives, Dudley and Petunia. "It's disgusting!" McGonagall finally hissed, unsure whether her revulsion targeted Voldemort's cold-blooded cruelty or the pitiable form Quirrell had become. Gradually, she let out a shuddering breath and chastised herself for the suspicion she'd harbored. Dumbledore had never intended them to witness the darkest depths of this struggle. He had no shameful secrets, only a desperate plan to save Harry. As the next scenes unfolded before them, scenes Harry and Dumbledore had already laid out in private, none of the professors were taken by surprise. McGonagall's anger tempered into solemn resolve, and Professor Sprout soon followed suit. Only Professor Flitwick remained rooted in sorrow, mourning the loss of one of his own house. Before long, a thoughtful silence settled over Harry and Dumbledore. They regarded one another quietly as if weighing unspoken thoughts. At last, Minerva McGonagall could contain herself no longer. With a teasing glint in her eye, she chimed in, "I'm not mistaken, Albus. You're blushing." Across the table, Pomona Sprout smiled knowingly. Having once fallen under Cupid's spell herself, she recognized that rosy flush immediately. "Well then," she added, "are you finally going to admit it?" Chapter 207 Report. After enduring so many alarming events, most people naturally look for ways to take their minds off the stress. Like any social creatures pulling a late shift, they crave a good meal, a hot bath, or some lighthearted diversion. In short, they need to have fun. That's exactly where Professor McGonagall and the others find themselves now. Between Voldemort's resurgence, the theft of the Sorcerer's Stone, the mystery of the cloaked young stranger, Quirrell's death, Harry Potter's growing power, Sirius Black's proclaimed innocence, and not least Snape's perpetual broodiness, the staff have been under relentless pressure. Thankfully, they're in the company of old friends and colleagues who have weathered countless crises together. Here, they don't have to bottle up their concerns. When Dumbledore began acting strangely, staring off into space, asking odd questions, and generally behaving unlike himself, the professors were intrigued, even a little alarmed. Their curiosity reached a peak when, during a recent meeting, the headmaster's distracted expression was caught on a magical scrying mirror. Voices rose in mild complaint. Why was Dumbledore so out of sorts? Harry, of course, didn't grasp why Dumbledore kept glancing at the ceiling whenever they spoke. But the professors did. They recognized that the headmaster's wrenching anticipation wasn't a matter of poor eyesight or eccentric habit. Something far weightier occupied his mind, a silent clue they were all determined to uncover. The truth of the matter was embarrassingly simple. The Philosopher's Stone recorded every event from every conceivable angle, and there was nowhere to hide. Even the tiniest twitch of Dumbledore's lips showed up in perfect clarity. He'd known this moment would come and wasn't unduly troubled by Professor McGonagall's mild reproaches. What gave him pause was Professor Sprout's sudden one-word remark. Confession? Dumbledore flinched. Could Pomona really read his thoughts? And why had she put that single word in quotation marks? He forced a bemused smile. "I'm sorry. Did you say something?" he asked, feigning innocence. At that precise moment, Professor McGonagall let out a gasp and passed him her copy of the Daily Prophet. The front-page headline blazed, Sirius Black, Butcher or Hero. Ministry confirms the truth. The accompanying article revealed the startling news. Sirius Black, long condemned as the most infamous prisoner ever to languish in Azkaban, had been proven innocent. The real traitor was none other than Peter Pettigrew, once lauded as a war hero and recipient of the Order of Merlin, First Class. Flipping to the editorial page, Dumbledore read a revealing footnote from Severus Snape, head of Slytherin House. Honestly, Snape wrote, I never had a favorable opinion of Black. I despised him. For a moment, the Great Hall was entirely silent. Then Dumbledore carefully replaced the paper under his arm and turned to his colleagues, his usual calm restored. Whatever awkwardness the stone had captured would remain strictly between its magic and him. An unjust martyrdom. He isn't a hero by any stretch of the imagination, one reader fumed. He murdered the very friend who betrayed his brother, and then voluntarily spent 10 years in Azkaban to atone for it. That same reader went on to explain that, after his arrest, Sirius Black repeatedly confessed to killing his brother's alleged murderer, all to spare Peter Pettigrew's elderly mother from scandal and disgrace. Pettigrew had betrayed James Potter only because his own family's safety was at stake. Even after exacting vengeance on the traitor, Sirius refused to let Pettigrew's family suffer for his sins. And make no mistake, Sirius could have leveraged his status as heir to the ancient, affluent Black family to avoid prison entirely. Yet he did not. This morning, Minister for Magic Cornelius Fudge placed the blame squarely on the shoulders of Bartemius Crouch Sr., who had once shielded his Death Eater's son from prosecution. Fudge revealed that Crouch, well aware of Sirius's innocence, chose instead to present Black as the killer. Dead or alive, it mattered little, simply to burnish his own record and fortify his claim to the ministership. Without a trial, Sirius Black was condemned to Azkaban. A subsequent inquiry has uncovered evidence that several of Crouch Sr.'s subordinates actively assisted in the cover-up, ensuring that the truth could never see the light of day, until now. We will investigate the matter thoroughly. A murmur of dissent ran through the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. Several senior officials, uneasy at the damage caused to the ministry's prestige, openly criticized Minister Fudge for declaring Sirius Black innocent. Fudge, visibly annoyed, waved aside their objections. Believe me, I had no choice. Black is innocent. This was the ministry's mistake, and we cannot let pride keep us from admitting it. I swore an oath to serve the wizarding community, and I refused to be remembered as the minister who clung to a false conviction. Effective immediately, Peter Pettigrew's first-class Sir Merlin Award will be revoked and reassigned to Sirius Black. Gasps rippled around the table. One official dared to speak up. Minister, these accusations reflect poorly on us. More importantly, they suggest you may have had other motives in reversing the verdict. Fudge narrowed his eyes. If you're implying I'm covering for someone, think again. You must remember that Bartemius Crouch Sr. oversaw this department before his retirement. I find it hard to believe he orchestrated such a grave miscarriage of justice entirely on his own. Silence fell. The question hung in the air. What really happened all those years ago? Thanks to the generosity of several vigilant and remarkably well-informed readers, I've pieced together the hidden story. What follows is what truly unfolded 11 years ago, before Harry Potter was even born. James Potter had long understood the dangers his family faced. As a trusted member of Dumbledore's inner circle, he concealed the Potters in their own ancestral estate, protected by a rare enchantment known as the Red Dank Loyalty Curse. This spell embeds a single secret deep within the soul of its appointed keeper, rendering it completely undetectable unless the keeper chooses to betray it. So long as that keeper remains silent, even the most determined pursuer could comb every corner of the Potter village without ever catching so much as a glimpse of them. Of course, that raised an obvious question. Who held such power over the family's safety? In Dumbledore's small, discreet network, James's favorite kind of organization, members were bound by friendship and loyalty. James himself had formed a close-knit trio famously called the Marauders, together with his best friends Sirius Black and Peter Pettigrew. Naturally, James entrusted Sirius as the Potter's secret keeper. Sirius, ever the prankster alongside James, was the perfect choice. The pair delighted in harmless mischief, particularly at the expense of Severus Snape, their perpetually exasperated schoolmate. Thanks to Sirius's steadfast loyalty and a good bit of bravado, the Potters remained hidden behind an impenetrable magical veil, at least until someone chose to break it. Everyone in the Order of the Phoenix already knew who the true secret keeper was, and that's exactly why neither Albus Dumbledore nor his inner circle ever spoke out to defend him. Yet a recent letter to the Daily Prophet from an enthusiastic reader pulls back another layer of the story. It was James Potter himself who first doubted his best friend, Sirius Black, deeming him too tarnished by his family's dark reputation to safeguard such a vital secret. Quietly, everyone but Sirius remained unaware, James persuaded the Order to entrust the secret to Peter Pettigrew instead. Peter's shabby little housebound mother, the argument went, would ensure his loyalty. But we all know how that turned out. Under pressure and fear for his own skin, Pettigrew betrayed James, handed him over to Voldemort's Death Eaters, and then framed Sirius for the Potter's murders. Only later, racked with guilt, did Peter acknowledge the awfulness of having followed James's arrogant counsel. He spent the years to come in endless remorse, forever asking himself why he never refused that fateful suggestion. And yet, in a twisted sort of way, the reader's letter calls him noble for his contrition. To accompany this exposé, the prophet published 2 haunting photographs of Sirius Black. The first shows him years into his Azkaban sentence, hollow-cheeked, waxy white, and with eyes that flicker with the last embers of life, almost vampiric in their intensity. His face is utterly still, only a stray lock of beard fluttering in the breeze gives away the Muggle world setting. The second image, by contrast, captures him in his Hogwarts days, youthful, defiant, and undeniably alive. Together they tell the tragic tale of a man both vilified and wronged, and remind us how a single choice, born of pride, can reshape so many destinies. Ryan's usual air of nonchalance never struck anyone as careless. If anything, it made him seem effortlessly handsome and utterly unrestrained. A faint hint of arrogance played about his features, suggesting he was always on the verge of some conquest. He flipped through the newspaper, breaking into a smile now and then. The happenings in the wizarding world were growing more and more entertaining by the day. Honestly, Peter Pettigrew might as well have stayed a rat. Just imagine Sirius's face when he tries to hex Scabbers for betrayal, only to discover there's no dark magic at all, just an ordinary mouse. Chapter 208, Sirius Appears Saturday, had arrived at last, and with it the eagerly anticipated Quidditch final between Ravenclaw and Gryffindor. The term was nearly over, and few students bothered to buy the Daily Prophet anymore. Most would wait until Monday to catch up on the news at home. To keep Harry in the right frame of mind, the staff had even delayed delivering that morning's paper. He still hadn't heard that his godfather had finally made the front page. Ryan and Hermione settled into the highest seats, bracing themselves for the game's roar. A few rows down, however, something, or rather someone, drew Ryan's attention. He leaned forward, squinting through the sunshine. There, in the front row, sat Sirius Black. Wrapped head to toe in a long black cloak, he watched Harry on the field with an intensity that bordered on desperate. That morning's prophet had shown a haggard, hollow-cheeked man with tangled, shoulder-length hair. This was a different person entirely. Sirius's hair was cropped short and neat, his face filled out with healthy flesh, his cheeks rounded, and suddenly he looked not like the gaunt fugitive in the newspaper, but like the spirited young man in his old Hogwarts portrait. On Madam Hooch's whistle, both teams rocketed into the sky, brooms blazing beneath them. Throughout the match, the players dazzled the spectators with precision passes, breathtaking dives, and lightning-fast chases for the snitch. Yet amid all the athletic fireworks, another figure, and the strange, wolf-like howls that erupted from him, captured everyone's attention. Each time Ravenclaw netted a goal or Harry Potter barked orders to his teammates, this tall, hooded student would lift his head and let out a long, piercing howl that echoed across the stands. Even commentator Lee Jordan couldn't resist pointing out the oddity. "Who on earth is that senior in Slytherin green?" he cracked, howling every time Ravenclaw scores. Talk about unusual fan support. But Professor McGonagall, seated only rows away, remained entirely unmoved. Her usual sharp eye for discipline seemed clouded today, as if her mind were somewhere else completely. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Some speculated that McGonagall's inattentiveness stemmed from Slytherin's long drought without a Quidditch cup. Now that the Serpents sat comfortably in second place, her greatest desire, to keep Slytherin from triumph, had already come true. Why bother enforcing the rules, they reasoned, but only Ryan knew the truth. The real reason Minerva McGonagall was so oddly distracted was the arrival of Sirius Black, once one of her favorite students, who now watched from the stands. His occasional wolf-like howls, coupled with Harry's uncanny resemblance to his father, James Potter, had stirred memories McGonagall could neither ignore nor resist. If a tall, dandyish young man and a short, rat-faced fellow had come to the stands, and if Harry had already traded his robes for Gryffindor crimson, their presence might have been enough to distract her so badly that she'd tumble right off that high platform. But the match was over before any more mishaps could occur. Harry's duel with Voldemort had honed his senses to a razor's edge. He'd been on his broom only seconds when he spotted the golden snitch glinting in the sunlight. Had Fred and George Weasley not been buzzing around him like two overgrown bees, hurling hexes and jinxes every which way, he would have caught it almost immediately. Still, they never dared to attack him outright, and after 20 fierce minutes, Harry's fingers closed around the tiny, fluttering orb. A strange ringing filled his ears as he banked hard and shot down toward the pitch. The snitch thudded into his hand, its wings beat weakly between his thumb and forefinger. Tears blurred Harry's vision, but he hardly cared. He swooped in on Roger, who was standing on the grass below. Harry's knees buckled, and he crashed into him, wrapping his arms tight around Roger's neck and burying his face in Roger's shoulder as loud sobs shook his body. From behind, Dennis and Woody ran into Harry, adding their wide-shouldered weight to the embrace. "Winner! Winner!" Phoenix yelled. "We've got the cup!" Henry and Keeper Haral's cheers rose in a triumphant chorus as the Gryffindor stands leapt to their feet. Harry pulled back just enough to glimpse the golden trophy, glinting as brightly as the snitch itself, and allowed himself the smallest, happiest smile of all. "We did it! We won the cup!" The Ravenclaws exploded into each other's arms, tumbling down from their brooms in a tangle of sky-blue robes and whoops of joy. They yelled at the top of their lungs until their voices gave out, then landed hard on the grass. Almost before their feet hit the ground, a sea of sky-blue scarves, banners, and cheering fans swept past the barriers and flooded onto the pitch. Hands reached out from every side, patting backs, ruffling hair, lifting players high. Harry found himself carried aloft by the surging crowd. He could barely hear his own heartbeat over the roar of celebration. Above him, Hagrid bobbed up and down, brandishing a wreath woven of sky-blue ribbons and shouting, "Brilliant, Harry! Brilliant!" The game's tension and yesterday's tears, when he'd first learned of Voldemort's return, seemed distant now, though his eyes were still red and puffy. Captain Johnny, stuck in the crush, hopped and punched the air like a man possessed, his usual composure entirely abandoned. At Harry's elbow, Ron and Draco were jostling each other to get closer, their broad grins rendering them momentarily speechless. Somehow Harry wended his way through the throng toward the stands, where Professor Dumbledore stood waiting on a raised platform. Flanking him were the school's other heads of house and Professor Roger Davies, who held the gleaming Quidditch cup aloft. Dumbledore beamed encouragement. Roger extended the trophy toward Harry with a proud nod. Harry stepped up and took the cup, his throat tight with sobs. He lifted it high, the silver gleaming in the afternoon sun, and the crowd's cheers hit a new crescendo. Then, cutting through the applause, a sudden, eerie howl ripped across the stadium. The sound was so sharp, so unexpected, that Harry's arm jerked and the cup wobbled precariously. For a moment, time stood still, and the celebration froze on a knife's edge. Harry peered through the crowd and spotted a figure draped in black robes. He looked like a seventh year. Could it be Eero, the Quidditch keeper, or one of Dennis and Woody's friends? Both those batters were in the same year, after all. Harry's heart skipped a beat as the realization settled in. This had been their last match. Next year, Captain Henry, Woody, Dennis, and even Eero, whose name he had only just learned, would all have graduated. He swallowed the sudden ache of loss, plastered a polite smile on his face, and joined the throng around the trophy case. If the Ravenclaw Cup wasn't coming back to the common room, this was at least the best spot to display their victory. With the gleaming trophy safely in place, Harry turned to head back toward the Ravenclaw dormitory, then froze at a sharp cry just behind him. "Boy, give me the mouse!" The voice rang manic and unmistakable. It was Ron, and the man in black robes was pointing his wand directly at him. Harry's hand shot for his own wand, but before he could draw it, dozens of wands whipped out from every direction, first from Ravenclaw students, then from the other houses spilling into the corridor. "What are you going to do?" someone shouted, tension crackling through the air as wands remained leveled at Ron, and at Harry. "Don't point that wand at the Weasleys." Percy Weasley's voice rang out like a thunderclap in the cold stone corridor. He and his mischievous younger brothers, Fred and George, still smarted from their crushing defeat in the afternoon's Wizards' chess match, and Draco Malfoy's smug smirk didn't help. "What do you think you're doing, Malfoy?" Percy demanded, inching forward. "Everyone, lower your wands," Draco ordered imperiously, raising his own in a warning gesture. Before tempers could flare further, Professor Minerva McGonagall stormed around the corner. Her robes billowed behind her, and her emerald eyes blazed through her square spectacles. She surveyed the scene, Percy and the twins brandishing wands at a sneering Slytherin, and assumed Slytherin had attacked innocent Ravenclaws. "Mr. Malfoy, put that wand away this instant," she barked. "He's after my scabbers, Professor," Ron Weasley shouted, vaulting forward to clamp his pet rat protectively against his shoulder. "A rat?" Draco laughed softly, stepping closer. His wand remained leveled, but his amusement was clear. "What's so special about this one, Weasley?" Scabbers let out a terrified squeak and wriggled in Ron's grip. Fred and George exchanged worried glances. Even Percy looked uncertain. McGonagall's eyes narrowed. She studied the trembling rodent as though seeing it anew. Suddenly, recognition flickered across her face. "A rat animagus," she muttered under her breath. "Impossible. No animal this small could be." "Professor, it really is Scabbers," Ron insisted, tightening his hold. "He warned me. He said someone." "A rat animagus," McGonagall repeated, her voice rising. She drew her wand so fast it seemed to streak through the air. "It can only be one man, Sirius Black." A collective gasp rose from the students. Before anyone could react, a dark figure slipped from the shadowed recesses of the corridor. He discarded a tattered black cloak, and where hood and cloak fell away, a gaunt face emerged, eyes alight with triumph, lips curling into a cruel smile. "Miss me, Professor?" Sirius Black's voice cut through the stunned silence like a knife. "You still can't keep me contained." The hallway erupted into a chaos of startled cries and flashing wands as McGonagall squared her shoulders, determined not to let the infamous fugitive slip away again. Chapter 209, The Madman Revealed. A ripple of excited whispers ran through the corridor as Sirius Black strode forward, his dark cloak billowing behind him. A dozen young witches and wizards pressed in, craning their necks to catch a glimpse. "Who is Sirius Black?" one first-year murmured. "Is he famous?" "He escaped Azkaban," another replied in awe. "How could he get out so fast?" a third asked. "And why haven't we heard about it sooner?" Nearby, Harry, Ron, and Hermione stopped dead in their tracks. Ron's face went pale, and his grip tightened on Scabbers, the little rat nestled in his robe. Harry exchanged a stunned look with Hermione. "Peter Pettigrew isn't dead?" Harry whispered. Ron's eyes darted to Harry. "He's my mouse," he snapped, panic creeping into his voice. Sirius Black paused, fixing Ron with a gaze so intense it made him flinch. "He's not a mouse," Sirius said in a low, hoarse voice. Ron stared at the rat, then back at Sirius, as if seeing both for the first time. "Of course he is," Ron stuttered. "He's Scabbers." "No," Black interrupted, his voice rising. "He's a wizard." A collective gasp swept the onlookers, and Professor McGonagall, who had just arrived, stepped forward, her eyes narrowing. "An animagus?" she asked sharply. "You're telling us Pettigrew survived and has been hiding in rat form all these years?" Sirius let out a bitter laugh. "Yes, James, Remus, and I were unregistered animagi. We lied to protect him." He spat out the words. "We said Pettigrew was dead. We believed him dead." Ron's face turned ashen. "But Scabbers has lived with me for 11 years. Hermione gasped. Professor McGonagall folded her arms. "Unbelievable." Scabbers, looking suddenly terrified, let out a high-pitched squeal. He dived for Ron's sleeve, claws scrabbling against fabric and flesh as he tried to dart away. "Give him to me," Sirius called urgently. His eyes never left the terrified rat. Ron pressed Scabbers tighter to his chest, backing away. "He's mine," he cried. "My father Percy gave him to me." A heavy silence settled over the group as Sirius took another step forward, his cloak brushing the stone floor. Every eye was on the rat, no longer Scabbers, but Peter Pettigrew, the traitor who had brought down James and Lily Potter, and sent Sirius Black to the depths of Azkaban. Sirius Black's voice cracked through the corridor like a whip. "The Weasley boy." He shook his wand so hard his knuckles whitened. The surrounding students fell silent, exchanging nervous glances with Ron, Draco, and Harry. From the crowd, twin voices piped up. "He's the scourge of magical creature poachers, one of the 3 musketeers who faced you-know-who, Ron Weasley himself." Sirius turned a furious glare on Harry, who wore James's expression to a fault, and on Professor McGonagall, whose wand was already in hand. Though he tried to rein in his rage, his eyes, dark and intense, never left the small, frantic shape of Scabbers beneath Ron's grasp. "All right, Weasley," Sirius said, voice low and controlled. "Hand him over. Let me examine Scabbers." Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her tone firm. "He won't be harmed," she assured the students. "Now, everyone else, clear the area." Reluctantly, the onlookers scattered until only Draco, Harry, Ron, and Sirius remained in the hallway's hush. Sirius fixed Draco with a narrow-eyed stare. "Slytherin," he said, "I trust you're not planning any mischief?" Before Draco could reply, Ron tightened his hold on Scabbers, his jaw set. "Enough," he snapped. He lifted the rat so Sirius could see him plainly. "He's fine. Just look for yourself." Sirius closed the distance in 2 strides, wand lowered but at the ready. McGonagall hovered by his side as he crouched to inspect Scabbers, his dark eyes sharp with suspicion. The hallway held its breath, waiting to see if the legendary Black Dog of Azkaban would show mercy, or if this small, trembling rat held far bigger secrets than anyone suspected. Ron's face flamed. "Sirius Black, if you really are Harry's godfather, you'd do well to keep your mouth shut. Stop slandering my friends." Draco's pale eyes brimmed with tears as he whispered, "Godfather?" "Yes," Ron said firmly, unable to hide his surprise. "Sirius is Harry Potter's godfather." A ripple of astonishment ran through the onlookers. Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her tone cool but laced with concern. "Mr. Black, surely you have more pressing matters to attend to. Mr. Malfoy is a friend of the Weasleys and of Potter. I can't imagine anything coming of your fears." Sirius scoffed. "Pressing matters? That boy is a rotten Slytherin. Nothing but trouble." His eyes glinted dangerously. "And you, Potter," he swung on Harry with unexpected sharpness. "When did you start keeping company with Slytherins? That's exactly what your mother would have done." Harry's cheeks reddened with anger. "Watch your tone," he snapped, stepping forward. Around them, fellow students stifled gasps. McGonagall's gaze flickered between Sirius and Harry, torn between her duty as headmistress and her loyalty to the boy she'd sworn to protect. The corridor fell silent, every eye fixed on the tense tableau, Godfather against Godson, Gryffindor against Slytherin, past grievances threatening to erupt all over again. Everyone here must think I've lost my mind. Now that Voldemort is gone and Hogwarts has returned to peace, Slytherin's once feared reputation has crumbled. They're no longer mere classmates to the other houses, but outright pariahs. Between Snape's obvious favoritism and the lingering whispers of dark alliances, Slytherins have grown insular, and to everyone else, little more than a nuisance. Even Professor McGonagall has long since abandoned whatever pity she once felt for me. Just now she caught herself recalling Severus's breakdown years ago, and her own failure to see the warning signs. She realizes, at last, how all her attention was fixed on threats outside these walls during the war, letting resentment fester underground here in the dungeons. I sweep my gaze over the great hall, bracing for the roar of applause I remember so well. But there's nothing, only stony faces and cold silence. In my day, any time I teased a Slytherin into good humor, the rest of the school would erupt in cheers. Now, nobody dares smile. My heart sinks when I notice Harry. His face is familiar, but his eyes burn with reproach. It hits me then. How many years have slipped away, how much has changed, and how alone I truly am in this new era. "I'm sorry, Harry. Before Ron could finish, Sirius's voice cut through the air like a blade. "I've been patient for far too long, Peter Pettigrew." For a heartbeat, remorse flickered across his face. Then it vanished, replaced by a wolfish grin. "Don't worry, Harry. I'll be gentle. Our old rat here isn't as spry as he used to be." Ron felt the temperature in the room drop. He knelt and gingerly lowered Scabbers to the floor. Professor McGonagall, her legs jellied by a jelly-legs jinx, couldn't move to protect the terrified rat. Scabbers crouched, whiskers twitching, but he dared not flee. Sirius's grin softened into something almost like bliss. He glanced toward the empty doorway, as if expecting an answer from some unseen ally. Together, silence. And then Sirius's laughter, low, triumphant. 1, 2, 3. A searing flash of blue-white light roared from his wand. Scabbers shot upward, his tiny body twisting in midair. Ron's scream shattered the hush. With a dull thud, the rat crashed back to the floor. A second flash lit the chamber, and then all magic, all motion went still. Sirius staggered back, eyes wild with disbelief. His wand fell from his trembling hand. No, this can't be real, he murmured, staring at the lifeless form before him. Professor McGonagall was mid-incantation when a sudden flash from Sirius's wand cut through her spell. On the cold stone floor, Ron's pet rat, Scabbers, twitched violently, then sprang to life and darted straight into Ron's pocket. "Oh, you poor thing," Ron said, cupping his hand over the little creature as he fell, to its frantic heart beating against his palm. McGonagall's emerald eyes glistened with unshed tears as she turned to Sirius. "Sirius Black," she said, her voice trembling slightly, "you have a great deal to explain to Harry. Will you join me in my office?" Sirius shook his head, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "No, I'm sure Harry despises me by now." Harry stepped forward and laid a hand on Sirius's arm. "No, Sirius, you spent 12 years in Azkaban. We're not angry, we're just relieved you're here." Ron chimed in, brushing Scabbers' fur. "Yeah, and look, Scabbers is fine. Besides, Draco's reputation was never exactly spotless." Draco Malfoy managed a lopsided smile, glancing between his friends. "Yeah." Chapter 210, Painful Memories. I've lived every day under the weight of that night, the night James died. My only purpose now is to atone for my sins. With Peter Pettigrew gone, the traitor who betrayed and led Voldemort to our door, and with Voldemort himself dead, the world no longer needs my vengeance. All that remains is my penance. By some mercy, or perhaps oversight, Wormtail's employer, Cornelius Crouch Sr., never put me on trial. I never endured Veritaserum or a magical memory inspection. Honestly, I've never been strong in occlumency. I would have failed to shield my guilt. In Azkaban, it was those memories, the flash of my brother's last moments, the echo of my friend's screams, that kept me from slipping into madness, unlike so many others. The Dementors feed on happiness and hope, but I have neither. My mind is a pit of regret and sorrow, and so they leave me to brood there in peace. Paradoxically, this unending remorse preserves my magic. As long as I remember my failures, I remain whole, and when the despair becomes too overwhelming, I shift into my animagus form, a great black dog. The Dementors cannot read canine minds, they sense emotions, not shapes. As a dog, I escape their cold scrutiny, my memories still intact, my purpose unchanged. I choose to remain conscious of my guilt. I endure the torture of my own thoughts so that I may never forget who I am or why I must atone. Each day in this cell is a sentence of remembrance and a chance, however slim, for redemption. I was lucky. Though Dementors possess human-level intelligence, they perceive the world only through emotion, and most of mine aren't remotely human. My pain was so intense, and I was so alone, that I slipped into my animagus form and became a dog whenever no one was watching. The Dementors simply assumed I'd broken under the pressure like everyone else and paid me little mind. During that time, I remember Albus Dumbledore visiting me several times. He was remarkable. He believed in my innocence and sensed something deeply wrong. Of course, he couldn't simply let me wander free, so on one of his visits, he even attempted to read my mind directly. Fortunately, I was in such agony that I managed to erect mental defenses he couldn't penetrate. Imagine his surprise when, despite every test, he found no clues of guilt. I still smile when I think how James would have congratulated me for mastering the spell Snotlout was famed for, though that fleeting pride was itself a happy emotion, and just as quickly as it came, the images of James and Snotlout slipped away from my thoughts. After that, time became a blur. Days, or was it weeks, passed in a haze so dreamlike I can't pin it down. Finally, I left Azkaban. They gave me Veritaserum and probed my memories once more, but it felt less like legilimency and more like someone drilling into my skull with a loud, whining Muggle power tool. Even now, the echoes of that pain tingle at the edge of my mind. Chapter 7, Electric Drills. I've always called Lily's insufferable relatives the electric drills, relentlessly nosy, always humming around, desperate to poke into everybody's business. James and I didn't fully appreciate just how aggravating they could be until he escorted me to their gathering. By the end of that afternoon, I was ready to tear my hair out. Leaving Azkaban was the happiest moment of my life, though. Once word spread, happy memories of better days washed over me so vividly I could almost taste freedom. Even the Ministry of Magic conceded and restored the Black family's confiscated estate. How did I react? With a wicked sort of glee. After all, those lands had been snatched away by Narcissa, my own cousin, and her new husband. Seeing it return to my name felt like vindication. Before long, I discovered that nearly every witch and wizard in the community knew my story. To their minds, I was a hero. James's ultimate sacrifice had become my shining medal. I couldn't escape the reverent looks people gave me, as if I carried a red-hot iron brand on my chest. A few old-fashioned souls even tried to find me a suitable spouse. Only then did I learn that Phineas Nigellus, the one black ancestor I detested above all others, had pulled many of the strings behind my welcome home. The very thought made me grind my teeth, but I would not let him own this moment of triumph. Electric drills be damned. I'd reclaimed what was mine at last. I nearly let it slip, the enchanted portrait collection I'd offered to donate. Thankfully, Professor Dumbledore reminded me that removing them all at once would cost several house elves their positions, and besides, I'll need those portraits if I'm going to move in with Harry when he comes of age. At that moment, I froze. Harry, James's boy. How could I have forgotten? Of course, I'm not the only one fixated on Harry's safety. Severus Snape, that snot-nosed git, has just been installed as head of Slytherin. A Death Eater, no less, or so everyone thought until Dumbledore revealed he's been working undercover for the Order. Even so, I worry. What will Snape do now that James's son is at Hogwarts? I first met Harry when I dropped by the Potter house. He's everything James was, down to the old hair-whipping grin, and not a bit smaller than his father was at that age. Seeing him there, so bright and curious, I begged Dumbledore to let me enroll at Hogwarts immediately. I needed to keep an eye on Harry, watching over him from morning until dusk. To my surprise, Dumbledore agreed. First things first, though, health potions. The price has suddenly plummeted, who knows why, so I stocked up without hesitation. While I was at it, I checked on Creature. He's still around, if a bit grumpy, and the portrait of my dear old mother couldn't resist one more lecture. But I didn't stay to argue. I have more important things on my mind. Tonight's the Quidditch final, and word is Harry will be the Seeker, just like his father. I can't wait to cheer him on. After all, I might as well take this chance to eat a good meal, get some rest, and prepare for the biggest adventure of my life. Hogwarts, Harry's safety, and whatever surprises Severus Snape has in store. I couldn't catch exactly which house he'd joined, but it had to be Gryffindor. Before I knew it, Saturday had arrived. I slipped into fresh robes and made my way toward the pitch, first pausing to exchange curt nods with Dumbledore and a few of the professors. Not a trace of Snotlout, of course. Instead, I ran smack into Peeves, who greeted me with that same wicked grin I remembered from my school days. Filch was skulking through the corridors, still as surly as ever, his cat trailing behind like a spiteful shadow. Today, luck was not on my side. I drew a black cloak over my robes and melted into the crowd at the Quidditch stadium. Word was that Potter had been sorted into Ravenclaw. Imagine that, but I barely noticed. All I cared about was the figure I knew I'd see up among the clouds, James's son. True to form, the boy soared above the field, outmaneuvering every seeker in his path. When that final golden snitch dropped into his fingers, Gryffindor erupted in triumph. The cup was theirs. Then my blood froze. There, perched on one of the Weasley brats' shoulders, was Peter, alive and grinning. A surge of hatred rushed through me. The traitor must die. Hold on, this chapter isn't over. Flip the page if you want more. Wait, he's here now. If I'd just walked out of Azkaban, I'd have lunged at him without a second thought. But things are different. I want Harry to stay with me. I need patience. Everything's changed. Potter and Malfoy have somehow become allies. Malfoy and the Weasleys are practically friends. It's like watching mice play bridesmaid to cats. And I slipped. I let Harry hear how I really feel about Lily. Will he agree to live with me? We'll see. First, though, there's still Peter to deal with. Professor McGonagall is coming this way. Sirius stood dazed in the dim corridor, his wand lying neglected at his feet. A swirl of thoughts raced through his mind. Once I finish this charade, I'll kill the traitor myself, and then I'll go to Azkaban. No one knew. Saint mistake me for a hero. I'm nothing but a failure. A small mouse scurried across the stone floor. Not Peter. Please let me die. Professor McGonagall's sharp voice cut through his despair as she swept aside the curious students. Harry and the others called his name, but their words washed over him like distant echoes. Sirius, come with Potter to my office, she ordered. placing his wand back into his hand with a firm shake to his shoulder. Her simple command felt like sunlight breaking through storm clouds, words he and James had heard countless times at Hogwarts. In an instant, the haze lifted from his mind and life returned to his eyes. Without a glance at McGonagall, he knelt before Harry. "You look so much like your father," he said softly, "but those eyes, they're all your mother's." He drew in a breath, guilt tugging at his voice. "I'm sorry for speaking ill of your mother and your friends, and for wasting your time." Harry flashed a grin. "I told you, you've been in Azkaban too long. Your head's still all muddled." This time Sirius caught every word and let out a low, wolfish laugh. "Right then, gather your friends and let's head up to the common room. I have a lot to catch you up on." He offered his hand to Harry and then turned to Draco and Ron with a courteous, if somewhat strained, smile. "Arthur is your father, isn't he?" said to Ron. "And Narcissa, she's my cousin." As they walked, Sirius braced himself. He knew he'd already ruffled feathers among Harry's companions, yet after exchanging a few polite greetings, and especially once he casually mentioned his magically enhanced motorcycle, Ron's frosty expression softened, and even Draco treated him with more respect than before. Most important of all, Harry himself no longer regarded him with pity, as though he were a sick child in need of sympathy. Instead, the boy's curiosity and warmth steadily grew. Professor McGonagall might have shot him disapproving glances all the way, but Sirius paid her no mind. Harry's acceptance was the only verdict that truly mattered. Professor McGonagall's classroom looked exactly as Sirius remembered. Rows of polished oak desks, walls lined with portraits of long-dead headmasters, and still that faint scent of chalk and parchment in the air. Sirius Black strode in with his usual flourish, settled into an empty desk with a satisfied grin, and waved Harry, Ron, and Hermione over. "Oh, Professor," he called out, voice booming. "Hasn't this place changed a bit in all these years?" McGonagall's eyes flashed in mock sternness. "Quiet, Sirius. Behave like the adult you claim to be, especially in front of these students." A hint of a smile tugged at her lips, softening her rebuke. Sirius glanced around at the eager faces before his gaze fell on a folded newspaper lying on the front desk. He grabbed it. "What's this? Today's Daily Prophet." Harry stepped closer and nodded. "It's about you, Sirius." Black's confident smirk froze as he opened the Prophet. The headline blazed across the page, and for the first time since his escape from Azkaban, he looked genuinely speechless. Harry noticed Sirius's stunned silence and felt a pang of sympathy. Sirius clearly wasn't prepared for whatever sensational piece the paper had printed about him. "It must be another article praising my accomplishments," Sirius muttered, voice low and uneasy. Then, with a sudden snarl, he slammed the paper onto the desk. "I won't read it. I'm no hero. I'm the man who failed James Potter." The other students jumped back, startled by the intensity of his outburst. McGonagall hurried around the desk to give him space, her expression a mix of concern and exasperation. "Sirius, you do best to ignore it," she said, snatching the Prophet away. "That's Rita Skeeter's doing, sensationalism at its worst." "Rita Skeeter?" Sirius echoed, running a hand through his hair. His usual bravado was gone, replaced by something raw and vulnerable. For a moment, the classroom was completely still, everyone waiting to see what he'd do next. Sirius shook his head, trying to clear the memory. "Oh, right, the fellow who's always spinning tall tales for the Nerd Academy. Sorry, I wasn't talking about Ravenclaw the house. I just never cared much for that girl." His words hung in the air for a moment, and when he looked up, Harry, Ron, and Hermione were all watching him with sympathetic smiles. Sirius blinked. He'd expected outrage at his offhand insult to the Ravenclaw student, but instead saw nothing but understanding. "What did I miss?" he asked. "How do you lot know her so well? Has she suddenly become famous?" "Trust me, you don't want to know," Ron said with a sour twist of his mouth. At first he'd been thrilled by Rita Skeeter's sensational scoop. It made him the talk of Hogwarts. But after everything he'd been through battling that mysterious dark wizard, he couldn't bear the attention. For the first time, he understood exactly how Harry felt under all that unwanted publicity. Sirius raised an eyebrow, intrigued. He glanced toward a corner of Professor McGonagall's study. If his memory served, that was where she kept her pile of newspapers and clippings. She always set aside the articles that interested her most. Perhaps those yellowed pages held the key to this Ravenclaw student's newfound notoriety. Sirius Black burst into the drawing room, practically vibrating with excitement. You'll never guess what's happened. Gringotts has been robbed. Can you imagine the nerve of whoever did it? And old Barty Crouch Sr. is behind bars. But here's the kicker. Young Barty Crouch is alive and living right next door to you, Harry. I always thought he died years ago. Harry blinked. Next door? Really? And Ludo Bagman, Sirius went on, grinning broadly. That blundering oaf, finally his luck's run out too. I always knew his day would come. Sirius paused, then threw his head back and laughed. Harry Potter's miserable childhood, he bellowed. Tell me, how are your aunt and uncle treating you these days? Harry gave a light shrug. They're adequate. I'm fed, and they don't lock me in the closet anymore. My clothes are all hand-me-downs, and Dudley used to torment me constantly, but that's changed now that he's at Hogwarts. He doesn't cross me anymore. He met Sirius's curious gaze. When he'd lived in that cupboard under the stairs, Harry had spent countless hours dreaming of some long-lost relative swooping in to rescue him. He'd even composed a speech, one that catalogued every injury and insult he'd endured, and practiced it so often he could recite it backwards. But those days were behind him. He was happy, and he didn't want to dwell on the past. Old clothes, huh? Sirius said with a chuckle. And your cousin Dudley's at Hogwarts. I'm going to track him down, see how he likes being on the other side for once. Harry cracked a small smile. If you do, tell him to stop stealing all my books. Sirius's grin grew wider. Oh, and that old fool Dumbledore? I'm going to have a word with him too. And the Dursleys, Petunia and Vernon, always did despise the James family. Merlin's beard, how they'll squirm when I show up. As the firelight danced across his godfather's eager face, Harry felt a surge of warmth. For the first time in his life, he wasn't just the boy under the stairs. He was part of a family, flawed and rowdy, perhaps, but his own. And that made all the difference. How could I have ever forgotten you, Harry? I shouldn't have stayed silent. When Dumbledore first came to me, I should have told him everything, so you and I could have grown up side by side. Harry stared in surprise. Even now, Sirius's temper was barely contained. The moment those words left his mouth, Sirius sprang to his feet and began pacing. If Professor McGonagall hadn't given him that stern look, Harry was certain Sirius would have vanished on the spot, probably to track down Dudley and give the boy a magical thrashing. You know my aunt and uncle? Harry asked, heart pounding at the thought of exposing the Dursleys. Sirius stopped mid-stride, his shoulders tense. Yes, well, I know of them. What a pair. Narrow-minded, prejudiced, despising both wizards and muggles. I even heard Uncle Vernon's in the business of selling drilling rigs. A dangerous glint flashed in Sirius's eyes. That's enough, Sirius, McGonagall interjected sharply. You only just escaped Azkaban. I don't want you doing anything rash. She met his gaze firmly. She knew that look all too well. Whenever Sirius's eyes clouded over like that, it meant he was on the edge of losing control. Sirius exhaled and licked his lips. All right, Professor. I know my limits. McGonagall let out an exasperated sigh. At the same time, Ron and Draco exchanged looks. They knew better than anyone how badly Harry's aunt and uncle had treated him. They were dying to cheer Sirius on, but with McGonagall watching, they managed only sheepish grins. Harry forced a half-annoyed, half-relieved smile. Voldemort had been right. Sirius might be a bit mad, but he truly cared about him. All right, enough staring. You're making me self-conscious, Harry protested. Turning to Professor McGonagall, he added, Professor, I've graduated already. Professor McGonagall peered over the edge of her daily prophet. Let me see. Harry Potter still at Hogwarts. Certainly an odd arrangement. She studied his face, noting the unmistakable resemblance to his father. If the James mentioned in this report is the same one, then who else could it be? At her words, Sirius Black let out a surprised gasp. According to the article's description, only he fit the bill. A sudden warmth stirred in his chest. If this were true, what did it mean for Lily Evans and James Potter? Sirius, that can't be right, Harry shouted, and Ron and Draco chimed in behind him. It just doesn't make sense. Sirius blinked, as if awakening from a dream. What are you talking about? He asked, glancing down at the newspaper in his hands. Harry, Ron, and Draco realized their friend had been completely lost in his own thoughts. and that none of them had noticed he'd stopped reading long ago. They exchanged worried looks, sensing that a much larger story was about to unfold. Chapter 212, Family or Justice. It was 1:30, and every soul in Professor McGonagall's second-floor study at Hogwarts seemed to be holding its breath. Sirius Black tapped a report anxiously against his knee. "Harry, is this the so-called evil tendency of Dudley Dursley mentioned in the last ministry report? You had no idea?" He shot Harry a skeptical look. Harry's face turned bright red. "No, of course not. I like girls." He buried his head in his hands. Professor McGonagall stifled a cough from across the room. She knew she ought to give them privacy, but honestly, a bit of harmless eavesdropping is a fine way to pass the time. Sirius's grin spread from ear to ear. "Girls, eh?" He leaned forward, eyes gleaming. "Which ones? When I was your age, I was quite the ladies' man. Let me see if I can help you out." He beamed at Harry in an embarrassingly fatherly way, his cheeks faintly pink with excitement. Harry scratched the back of his neck, mortified. "Honestly, none. I've barely thought about any of them. I'm not there yet, okay?" From his perch by the bookshelf, Ron Weasley puffed out his chest. "Oh, come on, Harry. We all know you've had a soft spot for someone. Don't deny it." He aimed a teasing grin at Hermione, who scowled in response. Silence fell for a moment, broken only by the crackle of the fire. In that pause, Harry realized just how complicated things could get when family, friendship, and justice all tangled together. And none of them had even begun to untangle the real mystery at hand. Draco Malfoy froze as a startling thought struck him. Ever since he'd become friends with Harry Potter, Harry had come to occupy the only real space in his life besides eating, drinking, and having fun. Could it be that Draco himself felt something more? He pressed a hand to his chest, his usual confidence faltering. Among the three of them, he'd always considered himself the most composed, the most mature. After all, he had a perfectly respectable crush on Pansy Parkinson. He was straight. Absolutely straight. Sirius Black's kindly expression vanished. He wasn't blind. He could see the hesitation on both Harry's and Ron's faces. At least the Malfoy heir still seemed like an ordinary boy. Draco's turmoil barely registered as normal in Sirius's mind. He could just about stomach the idea of Potter and Weasley becoming friends, but Potter falling for a Malfoy? That would be a nightmare. "We're still children," Harry blurted, glancing from Sirius to Draco. He could feel Sirius's gaze drilling into them. "Children? Fine, I'll accept that," Sirius shot back, smacking his lips. "But does that mean everything Rita Skeeter wrote is pure fabrication? Why did her story seem so believable?" He glanced down at the crumpled sheet of paper, the report Professor McGonagall had expressly warned him not to read, and let out a short, contemptuous laugh. "I take it all back. Rita Skeeter is nothing but a fraud." Then, almost to himself, he added, "And, would you believe it? In an earlier letter, Snape claimed he was the hero of the whole affair." Sirius Black stood in the Order's war room, hands trembling around the brittle inquiry report. He'd read it more times than he cared to admit, and every time, the footnote signed "Unknown Enthusiastic Reader" grated on him. He could almost smell the greasy hair oil on the parchment. "It all comes down to Peter Pettigrew and his poor old mother," he snarled, flinging the report onto the table. "He wasn't allowed to betray us, yet here we are." He straightened and read aloud with bitter amusement. "Arrogant James Potter suspected Sirius, thinks he's too unreliable, given his background." "Damn snot-nosed man," Sirius barked, slapping the desk. "That unknown enthusiastic reader. Tsk, I can practically smell his hair oil from here." He spun to face the assembled members. "No, I have a mother too. Yet I didn't crack. I didn't sell out. This was for James." His eyes flashed. "Peter is nothing but a coward who clings to anyone stronger. He sneaks around powerful people, always looking for protection. He picks friends who can watch his back. Disgusting rat." He paused, his voice trembling. "It was always the four of us, me and Remus, James, and that mysterious man, until he sold us out." He pressed his knuckles to his temples. "And James didn't believe me. I suggested Peter as our secret keeper. It was my idea. I'm the fool." Professor McGonagall stepped forward, her tone measured. "Sirius, why would you choose Peter? His single greatest weakness was obvious, his devotion to his mother." A quiet voice at the far end of the table rose to meet hers. "He's a member of the Order of the Phoenix. Sacrificing for the greater good is what we do. Sirius let the report slip from his fingers. The pages fanned out on the floor. A heavy silence fell over the room, each person left to ask the same question. How could they ever trust anyone again? Sirius Black bristled with impatience. I'm ready to die for this cause. Ron Weasley sprang to his feet. No, family matters just as much. My mother didn't join the Order of the Phoenix just to see us safe. She joined to protect all of us. As Ron's voice rang out, he felt a chill run down his spine. He could almost see Peter Pettigrew in his own reflection. He didn't know how Pettigrew would later justify himself. Sirius, what choice did I have? He who must not be named. His power was unimaginable. I was terrified. He threatened my family. But Ron vowed, then and there, that he would never turn on Harry, no matter the threat. If push came to shove, he would stand his ground, even if it cost him his life, rather than flee like Pettigrew, whose cowardice ultimately led Sirius to deal out his own brand of justice. Sirius folded his arms. You're still a child, he said coldly. Ron's cheeks flushed with indignation, but he refused to back down. Before the tension could flare any further, Sirius's expression softened, shadows passing over his face. Listen, Sirius said quietly, I understand more than you know. My brother Regulus, he died because I convinced myself I was invulnerable. Regulus was not like me. He was cautious, thoughtful, far too trusting of the dark side, and in the end he paid the ultimate price for it. He joined the Death Eaters, thinking he could control them. He couldn't, and I lost him. He turned away, voice thick with guilt. Don't mistake courage for recklessness. There's a line between bravery for friends and blind sacrifice for family. Learn to walk that line, Ron, or it'll break you. With that, Sirius left Ron to grapple with the weight of loyalty, fear, and the true cost of both. He wasn't killed by an Auror. No, he was slain by Voldemort himself, or more precisely, at Voldemort's command. Sirius stared at Ron, surprised by how calmly the boy spoke of his own brother's death. He'd assumed Ron would be too shaken to even mention it, let alone explain it with such cold clarity. I know Regulus, Ron said quietly. He was terrified of the things Voldemort demanded of him, but by then he was in too deep to walk away. You can't hand Voldemort a resignation letter. You either stay on his side forever or you die. Sirius's eyes narrowed. If he was so afraid, why didn't he reach out to us sooner? Ron's gaze dropped to the floor. I begged him. I told him to turn his back on all of it and come join us. But before Voldemort revealed his true face, a lot of people thought some of his arguments made sense. Even my parents, and Regulus himself. He lifted his head, voice firm. They all agreed to uphold pure-blood supremacy, to eliminate Muggle-borns, to restore power to old wizarding families. In the end, they regretted it, unfortunately, far too late. They found out Voldemort would stop at nothing to seize more power, and the moment they realized it, they grew fearful and backed away. Sirius let out a sarcastic snort. I'm sure Mum and Dad think Regulus is some brave little hero. He signed up as a Death Eater the instant he finished school. Harry frowned. Maybe your brother was just trying to protect the family. He's so wanting to give people the benefit of the doubt. He'd done it for both Quirrell and, now, Regulus. Sirius shook his head. Maybe, he said, but it doesn't change what happened. I believe Regulus is decent at heart, and you might be right about his motives, but don't let that blind you to the truth. He paused, his expression hardening. And Wormtail, he spat the name. Peter Pettigrew? He was no noble soul. Harry, you're free to criticize my distrust of Slytherins, but back then, Slytherin House had a horrible reputation. Almost nobody volunteered to side with Voldemort, except those black market fanatics who became Death Eaters. In school, James Malfoy tormented your mother, Lupin suffered their pranks, and Peter, well, he delighted in picking on anyone weaker than himself. Chapter 213. The hateful Sinpy family and justice mattered deeply to everyone, yet each of us interprets them differently. For Sirius Black, whose values clashed completely with those of his relatives, the Black name held no affection after he watched his own kind turn their backs on one another. James, more than any blood tie, was the one person Sirius truly cared about. When he graduated, he joined the Order of the Phoenix not purely out of a love of justice, but out of loyalty to James. Above all else, Sirius prized his friendship with James and the cause they shared. Harry and the others, however, all held family bonds in high regard. As the conversation paused, Sirius explained why he'd constantly found himself at odds with the Slytherins, and just how untrustworthy Peter Pettigrew really was. Harry, meanwhile, had been reading an article by Rita Skeeter in the Daily Prophet. Skeeter's account of events didn't square with Sirius's version, and Harry found himself bristling. He'd never understood the appeal of picking a fight for no good reason, a mindset Draco, with his own grudges, found easier to comprehend. "Is this what Rita Skeeter wrote about you and Professor Snape? That you're always looking to make trouble for him? Wasn't he, my mother's friend?" Harry asked, tapping the newspaper to emphasize the headline. Sirius let out a low chuckle and raised one eyebrow. "Me?" he replied, amusement dancing in his eyes. "Troublemaker? Perhaps it's time you heard my side of the story." Title: Old Grudges and Dark Magic. Sirius Black leaned back in his chair, glancing around at his small audience. Harry's guarded expression, Professor McGonagall's raised eyebrow, and Remus Lupin's thoughtful but somber gaze. With a low sigh, he began. "To be honest, I did it mostly for James." Professor McGonagall tilted her head. "For James?" Sirius nodded. "Your mother's friend, Severus Snape. He was a Slytherin, and not just any Slytherin. He ran with the worst crowd in the house. All of them eventually became Death Eaters." Harry frowned. "Even Snape? But Dumbledore told us he was our spy." "Dumbledore saw the bigger picture," Sirius replied, voice guarded. "All I knew was that Severus resisted us at every turn, yet Lily Evans stayed loyal to him. Even when his friends tormented her classmates with those creepy, humiliating pranks, she never wavered." He paused, meeting Harry's eyes. James saw Lily's loyalty and panicked. He adored her and couldn't bear the thought of her being influenced by, well, that lot, so he struck back. Sirius's eyes grew distant. At first, it was childish harmlessness, ink-squirting quills, enchanted spiders in Snape's cauldron, but each time, the pranks grew bolder, more dangerous. James was desperate. Harry let out a short, bitter laugh. "Couldn't handle a taste of his own medicine, huh? Looks like Lupin still can't keep your mischief in check." Remus's jaw tightened. Professor McGonagall cleared her throat. "Harry," she said, "that's enough. This doesn't concern." Sirius held up a hand, silencing them both. "I'm not blaming Remus," he said quietly, "but let's not pretend Severus was innocent. He fought back every time. More than once. It took the four of us, James, Peter, Remus, and me, to subdue him. That boy had already mastered more dark magic than any of us realized." A heavy silence fell. Old rivalries and long-buried tensions wove through the room as the past settled around them once more. "We were all arrogant little fools back then." Harry frowned, the disbelief plain on his face. Sirius sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "Harry, we were just kids who didn't know any better. We stopped acting like that once we turned 15. Harry's expression didn't soften, and Sirius couldn't bring himself to lie, especially not to a boy who looked so much like his father. "All right," he admitted. "We got carried away because of the falling out between Snape and Lily. James felt he had to prove himself worthy of Lily's friendship." He paused, choosing his words carefully. Before we were 15, James and I excelled at nearly everything. Everyone thought we were unbeatable. We just lacked self-control." "But Lily wasn't impressed," Sirius continued. "She despised our antics, the pranks, the teasing. She saw us as nothing more than attention-seeking brats. And of course, none of it helped her opinion of Snape either. She hated him for pursuing dark magic, but she hated us too, for making a fool of ourselves at his expense." Harry shook his head in disbelief. "Then how did she ever agree to marry him? She hated his guts." Sirius offered a wry smile. "I told you, James grew up. He matured, stopped the pranks, stopped the petty rivalries, just like I did. By the time we were 16, those days were behind us." Harry's next question was almost a whisper. "Including with Professor Snape?" Sirius's grin was rueful. "That, Harry, was largely on Snape himself. He had to make the choice to move on, too." He leaned back in his chair and studied Harry's thoughtful face. "We were all just kids once, Harry. Kids who needed to learn some hard lessons about respect and responsibility." Harry considered Sirius's words, the weight of the past settling over him. For the first time, he began to see how far everyone had come and how much had changed since those reckless days. He never let an opportunity slip by to insult James, and every time, James had to grit his teeth and hold his tongue. Harry shrugged. And later on, James wouldn't even defend himself, certainly not against your mother. He kept at it like that all the way through Hogwarts, and it wasn't until 7th year that Lily finally agreed to go out with him. Sirius leaned forward, his face tightening. We may have all misjudged Snape. Yes, he served as Dumbledore's spy, but he was also a vindictive bully. We clashed constantly. He was the first to mock James, even tried to hex him right off his broomstick. Remember that old Gryffindor chant? Brawn over brains. Harry glanced at Professor McGonagall. She gave a small, knowing smile. It's true that James's disciplinary record improved drastically after 5th year. He went from Fred and George levels of mischief to something more like Percy, she said. If you like, I can fetch his old violation reports. Harry nodded, convinced. Sirius drew in a shaky breath, anxiety flickering in his dark eyes. All right, Harry, I'll go first. He paused, as though steeling himself. I need one thing. One last chance. I know you don't approve of how I've behaved, and you have every reason to be angry, but I can't walk away without asking. Not after everything. Of course, Sirius Black said softly, if you'd rather live with your aunt and uncle, I understand. But, well, just think it over. If you ever want a different home. What? Living with you? Harry's voice shook. You mean I wouldn't have to go back to the Dursleys? Sirius's face clouded with confusion. You're not making any sense. Harry held up a hand. No, sir, that's not what I meant. Of course I'd like that. I don't think Mr. Potter meant that, Draco interrupted gently. Ron and Professor McGonagall chimed in almost at once. Harry, tell him. Sirius knelt down, eyes searching Harry's. Are you mad? Has Azkaban scrambled your brain? Harry found his voice, rougher than usual, a mirror of Sirius's own hoarse timbre. No, I'm perfectly sane. I want to live with you. Do you have a place? When can I move in? I'm going to find Dumbledore. Sirius sprang up, turning away as tears glistened in his voice. You can ask Draco. I inherited the Black family estate. I want to give you a truly princely life. In a moment, his footsteps rang down the corridor, growing fainter until they faded away entirely. It was 3 o'clock as Harry walked out of the castle, Sirius's offer echoing in his mind. I've finally figured out where that line about Sirius Black comes from. Ron exclaimed, leaping to his feet. Grasping his throat dramatically, he launched into a perfect Rita Skeeter impression. In the wizarding world, everyone Bella, Eve's his childhood should have been treated like royalty. Honestly, Ron, Harry sighed, shaking his head, you remember the strangest things. Draco snorted. If you put half as much energy into your schoolwork as you do into these conspiracies, you wouldn't be fretting over your potions and charms grades, and you wouldn't be letting some mysterious stranger pull the wool over your parents' eyes. He smirked, then switched effortlessly into a mocking Ron voice. Mother, father, my dreadful potions and charms marks are all Sirius's fault. Harry and I simply must stop him from getting the Philosopher's Stone. Harry and Ron exchanged exasperated glances, already dreading Draco's next taunt, and the sticky web of rumors they seemed destined to chase. Chapter 214, Conversation at the Black Lake Pier. Harry hardly registered Ron and Draco's chatter as they made their way beyond the castle walls. His mind was racing. He was actually going to leave the Dursleys, going to live with his godfather, his father's best friend, Sirius Black. It felt surreal. What would happen when he told Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon that he was moving out? He'd rehearsed that moment 1,000 times, and somehow he still felt a pang of reluctance. Was it because Dudley wasn't as awful as he used to be? Or because Dudley, the Dursleys' prized baby Dada, had suddenly become a wizard himself, and now his aunt and uncle doted on him in a way they'd never shown Harry? The questions swirled in Harry's head, mixing with memories of countless mornings when he'd rolled out of bed and stared up the staircase at 2 or 3 spiders dangling from the rafters. Back then, he knew nothing of his true identity, had no idea how his parents had died, and didn't understand the strange occurrences that always seemed to follow him. He still remembered those restless dreams, chaotic images punctuated by flashes of green light that had haunted him for years. A fresh wave of anxiety tightened his chest at the thought of Aunt Petunia's reaction. He let out a slow breath as they approached the Black Lake Pier, steeling himself for the moment he'd been dreading and dreaming of in equal measure. He froze. You actually knew Professor Snape? He asked, disbelieving. She gave a small, wistful smile. Yes, he was one of my mother's oldest friends. They practically grew up together. His throat tightened. All at once, memories snapped into focus. Hushed conversations between his father and Severus, the awkward silences at family gatherings, the tension that lingered long after his mother's death. A cold knot formed in his stomach. If Snape had been Dumbledore's spy inside the Death Eaters, even during his Hogwarts years, it would explain a lot. His willingness to infiltrate Slytherin's most fanatical circle, his tolerance for their cruelty toward his mother's friends, it had been part of some larger mission. But did that mission cost him the one person he truly cared about? Sirius had insisted Snape and his mother were merely friends, yet the pattern felt too pointed to be innocent. What if there had been more between them? What if his father, certain that Severus was a dark wizard at heart, had driven a wedge between them? It would make bitter sense. Snape ends the relationship for Dumbledore's sake, and a heartbroken widow finds comfort in someone new, his father. And as for Voldemort's vaunted pure-blood creed, he didn't really care about pedigree. What he craved was absolute loyalty, and that, he realized, was the one constant binding every twisted thread of this story together. Harry replayed the pieces he'd learned from his encounter with Voldemort. Severus Snape, the brilliant potions master, was now head of Slytherin House. He wondered, bitterly, if his mother and Snape had been close, might she still be alive? No wonder Snape had loathed him at first, sneering at everything he did. And yet, now he treated Harry differently, perhaps because of those same vivid green eyes, the very ones Lily had, or maybe because Harry had shown a knack for potions just like her. They walked out onto the stretch of grass by the boathouse on the Black Lake, and Harry couldn't keep the questions bottled up. It all comes back to Dumbledore, doesn't it? How could he let me, even me, go through all this? Ron shook his head. You're overthinking it. Dumbledore would never force a student into danger. But he chose me to face Voldemort, didn't he? He gave me that role, though he didn't make me accept it. Albus respects free will, Ron insisted. Even if he hopes we'll do the right thing, he never bulldozes us. Harry's voice rose with excitement. That's just like Snape. He acted as Voldemort's spy for the greater good. Maybe he did it out of loyalty to my mother, too. Lily was a muggle, and Snape loved her. He'd want to topple Voldemort for her sake. Ron exhaled. You really do think the world runs on Dumbledore's grand designs, don't you, Harry? Draco's sneer was as cold as the night air. This is your bad habit, Potter, just like Quirrell and Peter Pettigrew. Harry stared at him. Whatever he'd been expecting, it wasn't that. Draco paced a few steps, arms folded. I don't buy this legend of Dumbledore's respect. He claims to uphold justice, but beyond that, our free will, yours or mine, means nothing. He just lets us think we have a choice. Harry opened his mouth to argue, but Draco cut him off. Remember the astronomy tower? How you and I got stranded on the roof and forgot the invisibility cloak? We were careless, sure, but Dumbledore knew exactly who was lurking in the Forbidden Forest. Yet he sent us there anyway. Harry pressed a hand to his forehead, recalling the brutal ache. Draco's voice dropped to a harsh whisper. Your head hurt so badly you could barely stand. If that Death Eater had struck then, you might have died. Harry winced. It was agony. Draco's lip curled. Exactly. My forehead ached too, but do you know what I told myself? Oh, this must be Dumbledore's kindness to me. He shook his head in bitter amusement. In the forest, I was so pounded by pain, I couldn't even raise my wand when Voldemort stood right in front of me. But afterward, no pain at all. Draco's eyes went distant. In that moment, my head felt like a second heart, pounding in my skull. He stopped pacing and turned to Harry, voice low and dangerous. We're nothing but pawns in his game, Potter. No matter how noble he sounds, it's his plan, not ours. Harry said nothing. Draco's words settled over him like a gathering storm. What if every move they'd made had been orchestrated by Dumbledore from the start? With its help, I even managed the disillusionment charm, Harry said, breathless with excitement. Ron's eyes widened as a realization struck him. He'd always trusted Albus Dumbledore implicitly, convinced that every choice the headmaster made fit into some grand design. But he'd never understood why Voldemort had been drawn so close to Hogwarts, why Dumbledore would allow such a threat to walk the school's corridors. Now everything fell into place. You see it too, don't you? Ron said, leaning forward. Dumbledore kept Professor Quirrell in the Defense Against the Dark Arts post on purpose. He wasn't being foolish. He was grooming you, Harry, pulling out your hidden strength so you'd be ready to face Voldemort himself. Harry stared at him, still catching his breath. At first, you looked like any other student. Your only oddity was that Peeves wouldn't come near you. But in those early lessons, you stood toe-to-toe with a man no one expected to harm you. That's when your magic truly blossomed. You floored Quirrell, twice, despite him being possessed. Harry's heart pounded as he relived the moment of raw power surging through him. Ron's eyes shone. The second time, Dumbledore took over the lesson himself and watched you like a hawk. He saw how strong you'd become, but also noticed that your skill wasn't quite refined. So he orchestrated the forest incident, leading you to face someone half alive, drinking unicorn blood to restore his strength. He wanted you to see exactly what you'd be up against, and to push your magic even further. Harry swallowed hard, understanding at last how carefully his every trial had been arranged, and how high the stakes truly were. Back when you first tapped into that power, it was unstable. So unstable, in fact, that you suffered for days, Ron said, rising to pace around Harry and Draco. But as time went on, your magic settled. You even defeated that mysterious adversary who'd only regained a fraction of his strength in those opening 3 days. Sounds like something Dumbledore might have arranged, doesn't it? Harry stroked his chin thoughtfully, and Draco gave a measured nod. It does, Harry admitted. Can you still call on that power at will? Ron asked, curiosity bright in his eyes. I'll try. Ha! Rai raised his wand, and a beam of iridescent light shot forward. From its glow emerged a creature, both majestic and sacred. Its plumage wasn't the fiery red of a typical phoenix, but a misty cascade of pastel hues, lavender, peach, and pale blue, that shimmered like a rainbow breaking through morning fog. Each feather caught the light in opalescent flashes, and from the bird's throat rang a pure crystalline song, ethereal and haunting. With a graceful sweep of its wings, the bird descended toward them. Its body was as large as a swan's, burnished crimson, and its long tail and talons gleamed like polished gold, arching behind it in elegant curves reminiscent of a peacock's plume. Chapter 215, Rita Skeeter's New Harvest. Harry stood on the edge of the Black Lake's jetty, staring in astonishment as 2 phoenixes whirled around him in a mesmerizing dance. One, a small, fiery bird he held gently in his palm, chirped in soft, crackling notes. The other, larger and regal, appeared suddenly beside him and sang in a clear, soaring voice that seemed to hang in the air like a glittering cord of magic. Is that the Ravenclaw phoenix? Ron whispered, his eyes wide with awe. He edged closer, completely captivated. Harry, did your spell do this? You can summon a phoenix. Draco Malfoy, who had been watching from a few paces away, shook his head. No, that's not from Ravenclaw. Professor Dumbledore's phoenix, Fawkes. He flicked his blonde hair back and frowned. It's responding to your bird, though. I've never seen Fawkes fly this far. A ripple of excitement spread through the nearby students. Voices rose in a chorus. Look, phoenixes. I'll bet a galleon Harry Potter just conjured one himself. So Ron was right. They really drove off the poachers. But where's the invisible beast now? Harry's cheeks warmed under the sudden attention. He glanced anxiously at the 2 fiery birds, now circling each other in a radiant display of crimson and gold. He hadn't expected anyone to see, let alone to turn it into schoolyard gossip. Harry, let's go, Draco muttered, tugging at his sleeve. He glanced around at the growing crowd, his expression tight. This is ridiculous. Embarrassed by all the stares, Harry nodded and gently cupped the smaller phoenix in his hand. With a final, triumphant trill from the larger bird, the 2 vanished, one in Harry's pocket, the other in a flash of amber light, and the murmurs of the students died away in startled silence. Draco exhaled, scuffing his boot on the jetty's wooden planks. Honestly, he said under his breath, I can't believe I helped call that much attention to us. Harry managed a sheepish grin. Next time, I'll keep the fireworks to a minimum. Together they slipped away from the pier, leaving behind curious whispers and the fading shimmer of phoenix fire on the breeze. If the time converter really could rewrite the past safely, Harry thought wryly, he'd have used it ages ago. He'd have cast a Confundus charm on his clueless younger self. Now, though, there was no going back. Harry, how do you shut this thing off? Ron's stomach growled so loudly it almost drowned out the din of students rushing toward them. At first he'd argued with Draco about cutting and running, but the longer they waited, the less appealing hanging around felt. Their reputation had already spread through the castle like firelight. No amount of skulking away would change that. And with dinner still hours off, Ron was starving. Harry gripped his wand tighter. "I'm not sure," he admitted. "I only know that before the spell hit its target, right in the back of Quirrell's head, it was supposed to vanish." He glanced over his shoulder at the gathering crowd. Professor McGonagall, Snape, and half a dozen curious fourth years, all converging on this courtyard like predators on prey. "I don't know how to cancel it now." He felt a surge of heat flow from his palm all the way up his arm. The moment the phoenix burst into existence above the wand tip, its warmth spread through every inch of Harry's body, and for a second he thought that warmth might save him yet. He mouthed a silent plea. "Don't let them see me. Disappear." The phoenix, a creature of molten gold and crimson flame, hovered above Harry's upturned wand. It paused, as though peering into his very soul, its fierce eyes winking once with inexplicable intelligence. Then, in the next heartbeat, it did something Harry never could have predicted. It didn't vanish. It didn't dive at Quirrell. Instead, as if drawn by a force only it could perceive, the phoenix drifted away from the wand's tip and settled gently against Harry's chest, its fiery plumage humming with quiet power. Harry stood frozen, every breath caught in his throat. Around him, the woe, or LD, slowed. Students halted mid-step, the headmaster and deputy headmistress exchanged alarmed glances, and Ron yanked at his sleeve, his face ashen. But Harry couldn't look away. The bird's warmth seeped into his robes, into his very heart, filling him with a strange, numinous calm. In that suspended moment, amidst the brimstone stench of fear in the courtyard and the distant rumble of approaching staff, Harry realized that whatever magic he'd unleashed, it wouldn't be undone by a word or a flick. This phoenix had chosen him, and whatever came next, there was no turning back. Fawkes tilted his head at them one last time and then vanished in a burst of red sparks. Seizing the moment, Harry, Draco, and Ron dashed back toward the castle. They'd barely cleared the forbidden forest before Draco skidded to a halt, panting. "Harry, you all right?" he demanded. But Harry didn't answer. He stood rigid, eyes glazed, as though he'd forgotten how to breathe. Ron slammed a hand to his mouth. "Blimey, he's not even breathing." Draco's expression darkened. He'd studied enough dark magic lore to recognize this disaster. A corrupted Patronus. A dark wizard's failed attempt at white magic could spawn devouring maggots. Here a phoenix, powerful, pure, should never have entered a human body. Yet that's exactly what had happened. "The phoenix didn't vanish," Draco muttered. "It sank into him." "Jesus," Ron whispered. He crouched beside Harry and checked his pulse, weak, almost imperceptible. "We've got to get him to Madame Pomfrey now." Draco tore open the front of Harry's shirt. Pale skin stretched taut over ribs that rose and fell in the shallowest of gasps. "Stand back," Draco ordered Ron. "Let me try something." Ron shook his head fiercely. "No, Draco, any delay could kill him." Draco's jaw clenched. "Then you go alert Pomfrey. I'll stay with him." Ron hesitated, then broke into a sprint for the castle. Draco pressed his wand to Harry's throat and whispered an incantation he'd only read once in a forbidden text, an ancient binding meant to expel unwanted spirits. A faint silver glow flickered around his wand tip, struggling against the darkness seething beneath Harry's skin. Harry's chest jerked. A rasp of air escaped his lungs. Faint color bloomed in his cheeks. The glow around Draco's wand flared brilliantly, then collapsed inward with a muted pop. Harry coughed, wheezing, and his eyes fluttered open. He groped at his shirt, confusion and pain battling across his face. Draco knelt beside him, exhaustion cutting through his adrenaline. "You're back," he said quietly. Harry stared at him. "What happened?" Draco helped him sit up. "The phoenix tried to inhabit you. I forced it out." Harry pressed a hand to his chest, where a cluster of faintly smoldering feathers lay against his ribs. "I felt it, inside me," he whispered, "like fire and ice." Behind them, footsteps pounded on the stone path. Ron and Professor McGonagall appeared, followed closely by Madame Pomfrey and a pair of worried prefects. Madame Pomfrey swept forward, her bag swinging at her side. Move aside, she snapped, and Draco yielded. Pomfrey crouched beside Harry, already murmuring healing charms. Silver light brushed over Harry's torso, knitting muscle and closing invisible wounds. Draco stood, shoulders shaking, as relief flooded through him. Ron clapped a hand on his shoulder. Thanks, Malfoy. You saved him. Draco met his gaze and managed a crooked grin. Anyone would have done it. Around them, the castle's windows glowed through the gathering twilight, a promise of safety and recovery, if only for tonight. Ron burst out the moment he spotted Harry. Honestly, Harry, look at you, all skin and bones. Draco Malfoy, standing beside him, raised an eyebrow. Curiosity got the better of him, and he stepped forward. His fingers, damp with sweat and noticeably cold, pressed against Harry's ribs. He clicked his tongue. You really ought to eat more. Harry recoiled, arms instinctively wrapping around his chest. Ugh! Stop! You two are going, to freeze me to death. Ron laughed, undeterred. Quit squirming, Potter. I just want to see if you've lost weight. Although Harry understood that Malfoy's concern wasn't malicious, he hated being handled like this, and Ron, oblivious to Harry's discomfort, seemed to think it was great fun. Even in summer, the chill of Draco's exposed fingers contrasted sharply with Harry's warmth. When Draco paused, Ron dove back in, poking at Harry's side. Draco frowned and reclaimed Harry's attention with a pointed look. Placing one hand firmly over Harry's chest, he tapped twice, then again, as if counting heartbeats. You're in better shape than I thought. Normally you'd be panting after that run. Harry pressed a hand to the spot Draco had touched and swore he felt 2 distinct thumps. Draco hesitated, half in disbelief, then gave Harry's chest a couple more gentle taps before stepping back. All right, Draco muttered, you're fit enough. He waved Ron off, then watched as Harry hastily pulled his shirt back on. They stood tucked into a quiet corner of the castle ramparts, precisely the spot that let them see anyone approaching from a distance. That was the only reason both Malfoy and Ron felt bold enough to fuss over Harry without worrying about an audience. They'd overlooked one detail. From above, you could clearly see the white fluff at the nape of Ron's neck, matted with sweat, that glinting in the sunlight. Harry had managed to stay dry at first, but Ron couldn't stop perspiring. His palms were still slick when he reached out. Then, as if on cue, a tiny beetle drifted past, the markings around its antenna resembling a pair of spectacles, and for a moment it was framed by a brief flash of magic. Kate, Ryan said, dropping into a crouch beside her in the Room of Requirements lounge, I've got the perfect question for you. Kate blinked and wrinkled her nose. All right, what is it? Imagine you're an investigative reporter. You've been handed a fat envelope of hush money and veiled threats to back off a story. Now, by some miracle, you uncover rock-solid proof that everything you suspected was true. Do you go begging for even more hush money, or do you blow the lid off and publish the exposé? Ryan reached for Kate's hand, but she yanked it away, rolling her eyes. This about Harry Potter and Rita Skeeter, isn't it? I bet it's just another of Harry's so-called secrets. Plenty of secrets floating around, Ryan replied coolly. But you know Ron Weasley. He's got a habit of running his mouth with half-baked rumors. Maybe this one'll stick. Kate tossed the pillow off the sofa and flopped down with an exasperated sigh. Honestly, I could write an entire epic about the three of us, every stolen glance, every awkward encounter, and that mangy Rita Skeeter would gobble it up. Ryan shook his head, setting his mug on the coffee table. It's not enough for her to run off the text, though. She'll want concrete proof. Kate sat up, eyebrows raised. What do you mean? Proof? A photograph? How on earth would she capture one if we didn't let her? Ryan grinned, leaning back into the cushions. You'd think you'd know this by now. I'm impressed it's your first question. Cut the cryptic nonsense, Kate snapped, reaching across to tug on his sleeve. Just speak English. He sighed theatrically. Fine. Rita's an unregistered animagus. She turns into a beetle. Kate stared at him for a moment, then burst out laughing. A beetle? You're kidding. Not at all, Ryan replied, eyes dancing. Last year, you two clashed right after you scoffed at her self-appointed title, Rita Skeeter II. You never needed my help to knock her down a peg, but I could tell she had plenty of vulnerabilities, especially early in her career. I've just been good at digging them out of her own writing. Kate rolled her eyes, but couldn't hide a victorious smirk. Leave it to you to mine a beetle for blackmail material. She stretched and stood. All right then, let's figure out how to keep that little bug from buzzing around our business. Chapter 216, Half-Blood Wizard. Dean Ryan was no idle gossip, but he was far from an ordinary wizard. His powers of perception had grown so keen that even without trying, he could sense a single dead leaf drifting from a tree deep in the Forbidden Forest. Under such scrutiny, it was impossible for Harry Potter, his current obsession, to go unobserved. Ryan caught every nuance of Harry's speech, every flicker of expression. What fascinated him most was Harry's mind. The boy had correctly suspected that Snape had spied on Lily Evans for Voldemort, yet he'd misread the timing, wonderfully so. He assumed Snape had been a traitor during his own school days, when in truth, Lily had recruited Severus long before Harry was born. Even more amusing was that Sirius Black, ever quick to judge, didn't seem to piece it together. As a result, Harry kept leaping to Snape's defense, painting him in an undeservedly heroic light. Watching these warped loyalties form felt like steering a great ship onto a new course and simply letting it sail. And then there was the matter of Lily's enchantment on Harry, a transformation so profound that it manifested as a living phoenix within him. Ryan had encountered a similar phoenix incarnation in his own studies. Was it fate, or just one of those uncanny coincidences that made rewriting this world such a thrilling experiment? As always, Ryan leaned back, curiosity alight in his eyes. He'd set the pieces in motion. Now he would delight in watching the game unfold. Even though Harry has long since grown past infancy, and the curse that backfired on Voldemort has vanished as a distinct spell, he absorbed it through Harry's blood, its power remains woven into both their bodies, and it will never ebb. That protection was wrought by a tremendously gifted witch at the cost of her own life. In effect, it was the continuation of Lily Evans herself, living on through magic. Originally, she bound it to Harry only until he came of age, so that its strength would peak precisely when he needed it most. But Albus Dumbledore discovered an unexpected side effect. The charm extends its protection wherever Lily's blood runs. Knowing this, he arranged for Harry to be raised by his aunt and uncle, the only true kin left, and thus ensured the spell would cling to him. Added to that, a fragment of Voldemort's soul lodged itself within Harry, inadvertently deepening the enchantment's spiritual resonance. It's a subtle, chilling warmth, one his mother might have felt herself, had she been there to notice. Now that Harry is at Hogwarts, he can sense the Dark Lord stirring in the shadows. Ron Weasley, ever the steady friend, was quick to guess the truth. Voldemort is gradually reawakening, drawn back to life by the very bond he unwittingly forged with Harry. At last, Harry found himself standing on the old wooden pier by the Black Lake. He closed his eyes as though speaking to his mother. "I'm safe now." A tingle ran through him, and in his mind's ear he heard the talisman, its voice as gentle as his mother's, reply, "No, you're not." That talisman had scanned the remnant of Ryan's dark infection in Harry's soul and had bonded with him, taking shape as a dormant phoenix spirit. Unlike Ryan, however, Harry lacked the mysterious plug-in that conferred true immortality. He could call upon the phoenix in moments of dire need, but he couldn't unlock its full incarnation form, nor could he perceive the secret mark it had etched on his heart. That latent power was akin to the pure force of love the Department of Mysteries called love energy, a magic so subtle that most wizards couldn't sense it, Harry included. He leaned into the quiet ripples of the lake, but it offered him no answers. Somewhere inside, he knew the talisman waited, and yet, for now, he remained helpless to release it. Meanwhile, back at Hogwarts, the Great Hall was bursting with noise and laughter. At the Gryffindor table, Fred and George Weasley were in full swing, joking and bantering with Lee Jordan, while the rest of the house cheered their rival's defeat. A few seats down, Dean Thomas sat unusually still, his eyes reddened for reasons Harry couldn't fathom. As the clatter of plates and voices swelled around him, Harry felt more alone and more unsettled than ever. Dean had become something of a friend, and Harry knew perfectly well that Dean Thomas wasn't much of a Quidditch fan. Across the Great Hall at the Slytherin table, Draco Malfoy was deep in conversation with Pansy Parkinson, while Crabbe and Goyle happily attacked their breakfast. Back at the Ravenclaw table, Harry found himself surrounded by curious classmates eager to hear about the Phoenix, and the wild rumor that he and his friends had broken into the forbidden corridor on the 4th floor. Thankfully, Ron was on hand, acting like Harry's own press agent. He fielded every question, skillfully shifting the spotlight onto himself. "That Phoenix by the Black Lake Pier?" Ron announced dramatically. "Not Dumbledore's fox at all, but the Ravenclaw Phoenix that lives atop the astronomy tower. It decided to leave Hogwarts for a while, taking its invisible beast friend with it, and it came down just to thank us before it went. Fawkes came along too, just a fellow Phoenix seeing off his pal." When someone tried to pry into the Forbidden Corridor story, Ron clamped his lips. "That, dear friends," he declared with a grin, "is strictly top secret." Suddenly, Professor McGonagall's voice rang out from the staff table. "Dean Thomas, Harry Potter, if you two would come here, please." Harry looked over in surprise. "Dean," he whispered, nodding as both of them rose to join their professor. "What's going on between him and Harry?" Ron whispered, bewildered. Dean Thomas dabbed at the corner of his eye, his expression oddly resigned, as though he'd known the answer all along. Without another word, he got to his feet and slipped down the aisle between the Gryffindor and Hufflepuff tables. Harry watched him go, heart hammering. Every head in the hall seemed to swivel toward him, the hush of hundreds of curious voices pressing in like a physical weight. Whispers swelled into a low roar. Was it serious? What could this have to do with Dean? At last the murmur reached Professor McGonagall's ears. She rose from her seat at the staff table, still mostly empty, since the end-of-term feast hadn't officially begun, and fixed Harry with a stern look. "You," she said, pointing to a heavy oak door at the back of the hall, "come with me." Harry exchanged a startled glance with Dean, then followed McGonagall. The doorway led them out of the great hall and into a narrow antechamber, its walls lined with solemn portraits of long-dead witches and wizards. The painted figures watched them in silence as the door swung shut behind them. The fireplace across from them glowed with an icy blue flame, its cold shimmer cutting through the hot summer air. The moment Harry and Dean stepped inside, every painted face in the room swiveled to watch. A shriveled witch clambered out of her frame and hurried into the next, where a stern-looking wizard with a drooping walrus mustache sat. The old witch leaned in close, whispering. The mustachioed man's eyes brightened with recognition. It was Sirius Black, deep in animated conversation with another wizard wearing a purple top hat. Harry's heart skipped a beat. He knew that hat from a tiny shop when he was a child, and again at the Leaky Cauldron. Professor Daedalus Digger. But this time, Digger didn't glance at Harry at all. His gaze was fixed on Dean, filled with tender concern. "You should have received your Hogwarts letter, Dean," Digger said, his voice soft with memory. "I'm Daedalus Digger, a friend of your father's. He never abandoned you. He risked everything to protect you and your mother from the Death Eaters." Gently, Digger drew a tarnished silver key from his robes and held it out to Dean. "This belonged to your father, Hadwin Jones. He was a Gryffindor, just like you." Chapter 217, The New Pureblood Theory. Harry strolled through the frost-kissed courtyard toward Sirius Black, drawn by the sight of Dean Thomas and Cedric Diggory leaning in close, their voices a private murmur on the winter air. Catching Harry's curious glance, Sirius lifted an eyebrow. "Eavesdropping on Dean and Diggory, Potter?" he asked with a faint smile. Harry shook his head, but nodded toward the pair. They seemed connected. I wondered what they were talking about. Sirius leaned back on the bench, folding his arms. "Dean Thomas is barely more than an acquaintance to you. If you hadn't ended up at the same college, you might never have met." Harry frowned. Then why was Diggory so interested in him? And who's Hadwin Jones? Sirius's expression turned wistful. "Hadwin Jones was a classmate of mine, and your father's. The moment he graduated, he walked away from our world and lived as a muggle. Years later, he reappeared without warning, only to refuse the Dark Lord's offer to join the Death Eaters. His stand cost him his life." Harry sat down, eyes wide. "So Diggory and Jones were friends?" "They were," Sirius confirmed, "like James and me. Yet neither Diggory nor any of Jones's other wizarding friends ever knew he'd married and had a son." He nodded toward Dean. "Dean Thomas grew up believing he was the child of muggles. His mother never knew her husband was a wizard until Dean got his Hogwarts letter. Sirius sighed. Some mistake that kind of secrecy for protective love. But hiding the truth from the people you claim to care about, can that really be love? Harry frowned, unsettled. He thought of Ron and Draco, of Ginny, of how openly they shared everything. If he ever married again, his closest friends would be the first to know. How could someone withhold the most fundamental truth of all from spouse and child, then call it love? He didn't have an answer, but he knew this was a new puzzle in the complicated web of pure-blood loyalties. "Why did you all have to go into hiding in the Muggle world?" Harry asked, perplexed. Sirius sighed and leaned back in his chair. "You weren't around back then, Harry. When the Death Eater's power reached its height in Britain, their first move was to conscript any outstanding non-Muggle wizard they could find. Those who refused were threatened, or worse. So many families simply vanished, erasing their magical identities and living disguised among Muggles. Dean's father, Mr. Jones, was one of them. As the Death Eaters grew bolder, they began hunting pure-blood wizards who'd settled in Muggle communities. Wizard-Muggle marriages were especially damning. The Death Eaters would kill the non-magical spouse first, as a cruel message. A wizard couldn't stay close to their Muggle family. They'd be sitting ducks. The only safe choice was to drop all traces of magic, cut ties, and vanish completely so no one would ever suspect. Harry frowned. Then how was Dean's hiding discovered? Did his father leave a warning letter for Digger? Sirius shook his head with a rueful smile. Not a formal warning, just a remarkable coincidence blended with a bit of foresight. You see, Jones had been quietly guiding Digger to Dean's family all along. Harry's brow shot up. "You mean Digger, the fellow who used to bow to me in that little Muggle shop?" "Exactly," Sirius said. "Digger's the kind of wizard who thrives on blending in with Muggles. He's a bit unhinged, in the best possible way. After Voldemort fell, he even conjured a spontaneous meteor shower over Kent, just for show. No warnings, no fireworks display permits, just magic. Jones counted on Digger's love of Muggle spectacle to draw any prying eyes away from Dean's family. It was wild, but it worked. It was even in the Muggle papers," Sirius said, shaking his head. "Too bad I missed it. Of course I was busy tailing Peter at the time. But I'm getting off topic. The point is, you need to understand just how determined Digger is." "Harry," he settled back, clearly amused by the memory. "A few days ago, Digger finds himself in Plymouth, Devon, ducking into a rundown Muggle pub for a pint. The place was papered with old newspapers, and on one wall he spots a familiar face. His old fishing buddy, Hadwin Jones, splashed across a front-page photo. Jones had just reeled in a 7-foot, 183-pound blue shark and was being celebrated as some sort of amateur champion. In the accompanying interview, Jones couldn't help but lament, "It's a shame it's a blue shark. Otherwise, I'd bring it home to share with my wife and kids." Simple throwaway line, right? But to a wizard like Digger, especially one as, shall we say, proactive as he is, that's an invitation. Within 48 hours, Sirius continued, Digger tracked down Jones's ex-wife, who'd since remarried, and to top it off, discovered that Jones's child was a witch or wizard enrolled at Hogwarts. Not just any house, mind you, but a proud Gryffindor. He closed his fist and punched the air lightly. "So you see, Harry, when I say Digger doesn't take no for an answer, I mean it. He'll use any lead, however small, to get where he wants. And that," Sirius added with a pointed glance, "is exactly what makes him so dangerous." Sirius paced the spaceship's observation deck, arms folded, scowling at the view screen. "You know, this whole debacle has handed some of the more obtuse students exactly the proof they were looking for." Harry frowned. "What proof?" Sirius shook his head. "Most of these troublemakers come from Slytherin, but not the serpents you've met in your classes. I'm talking about the new hardliners who've taken to resurrecting pure-blood dogma." Before Harry could ask more, a familiar, excited voice echoed down the corridor. "Harry Potter, I hardly recognized you without your battle scars." They turned to see Dig bounding into the room, face bright with greeting. "And this," he added with a flourish, "is Dean Jones, my friend's son." Behind Dig stood Dean, eyes rimmed red and glistening. He wiped at his cheeks and clutched a small brass key so tightly his knuckles went white, as if the weight of it anchored him. Harry offered a gentle smile and a nod. Dig let out a nervous chuckle. "Well, This is a reunion I didn't expect. But back to business. What was that about a pure blood movement in Slytherin? Harry glanced at Sirius, who gave a quick tight nod. They're calling it the new Slytherin pureblood theory. The idea is that Muggleborns, pejoratively called mudbloods, aren't true witches and wizards. They claim that any Muggle ancestry somehow dilutes magic itself. Diggs snorted in disbelief. So because your grandparents were Muggles, according to them, you're magically inferior? Preposterous and insulting. Dean's grip on the key loosened, just enough for his knuckles to pale slightly less. He took a steadying breath, as though Harry's and Diggs' presence reminded him he wasn't alone. Sirius's expression softened, for the first time since the argument began. Exactly. They think this incident proves their point, that only pureblood lines deserve respect and power. Harry folded his arms, determination settling over him like a cloak. We'll show them how wrong they are. In the hush that followed, the four of them, godfather, godson, friend, and hesitant newcomer, stood united, ready to challenge the ridiculous, hateful theory that threatened to split their school yet again. They're just countrymen who somehow ended up in the Muggle world by accident, Diggs said with a shrug. Sirius Black rolled his eyes. Harry, don't be fooled into thinking these pureblood fanatics spare Muggleborns because they respect them. They only take Muggleborn wizards seriously as opponents to crush. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. Look at Terrence Higgins, the Slytherin seeker you faced in your second match. His father is an old acquaintance of mine, and his whole family believes in that new pureblood supremacy nonsense. Before the game, Terrence was as polite and well-mannered as you like, but once the match began, he pulled every dirty trick in the book. That's how the Higgins clan operates. On the ball, air best behavior until it suits them to get their hands dirty. Remember what they say, a dog that bites doesn't bark. Harry frowned, recalling Higgins's sneaky hex on the bludger. I do remember, he was so courteous before we started. Sirius nodded. Exactly. They'll smile at you, then strike when you least expect it. Keep your guard up, Potter, and you too, Dean. He turned back to Dig. And you, what else do you plan to do at Hogwarts besides looking after Dean? I've revised the passage for clarity, flow, and idiomatic style while keeping every plot point and character intention intact. I've won Dean's mother's permission. I'm taking him back to the Jones family's ancestral estate for summer break, and I want to ask Dean in person, one last time. Dee said this with a triumphant grin, but Sirius Black couldn't help frowning. I'm in the same boat, DG, Sirius admitted quietly. I want Harry with me too, not just for the summer, but forever. Dumbledore refused my request. He raised his voice, almost roaring. I've read Rita Skeeter's article. I don't believe her gossip, but she was absolutely right that Harry deserves a permanent home. DG's shoulders slumped. I applied to adopt Harry too. Dumbledore turned me down as well. Sirius looked away, guilt flickering in his eyes. He dreamed of telling his godson they could live together someday, ever since their first meeting, but now all he had to offer was disappointment. That was why he distracted Harry with everything else instead. Harry's voice cut into the awkward silence. So what about summer? Dumbledore won't let me stay with the Dursleys even for vacation. Sirius met Harry's gaze. He forced a small, rueful smile. I never asked. This version preserves all essential details. The Jones family estate, summer vacation plans, Dumbledore's refusals, Rita Skeeter's report, and the emotional undercurrent between Sirius, Dee, and Harry, while ensuring the narrative reads naturally to an English-speaking audience. Chapter 218, Year-End Dinner. Before Ryan ever traveled through time, he was an avid Harry Potter fan. Beyond the published novels, he scoured every scrap of J.K. Rowling's unused material, especially the drafts that hinted at Dean Thomas's wizarding father. Although Rowling considered giving Dean a magical parent in her early outlines, she ultimately left him an orphan to keep Neville Longbottom from being relegated to the prime supporting role. Ever since, Ryan has been eager to explore that lost backstory. In his day-to-day life, Ryan balances running the family business with his magical studies, while still finding time to accompany Penello and Kate, and to tease Hermione when the mood strikes. On the side, he's been unearthing forgotten tales of minor characters, and the story of Dean's father is one of his favorites. At the center of that tale is Dedallo Dig, a warm-hearted, daring wizard and a close friend of Mr. Thomas. In the original timeline, during Harry's 5th year at Hogwarts, Harry was pursued by Dementors outside Number 4, Privet Drive. Dedalus Digg joined Alastor Mad-Eye Moody, Kingsley Shacklebolt, Nymphadora Tonks, and several other Aurors as a broomstick escort, creating a protective shield around Harry as they flew him to safety at Number 12, Grimmauld Place. Ryan couldn't help but wonder, what other adventures did Digg share with Dean's father? And what might change when those stories finally come to light? As the year draws to a close, Ryan's curiosity has only grown, just in time for their long-anticipated year-end dinner. Harry stepped into the cramped hallway of 12 Grimmauld Place, the current headquarters of the Order of the Phoenix, and took a steadying breath. It was his 7th year, but there was no Hogwarts life for him now. With Voldemort on the rise, he and the other members of the Order had accepted a new mission, to protect the Dursley household from any dark magic that might reach them. Although Harry was officially part of the Order, he wasn't a ministry employee. He'd made himself a freelance wizard, taking on odd jobs that caught his interest, and otherwise spending his days in the familiar common room of the Leaky Cauldron. His latest commission had come via a carefully worded request from the Ministry's Department for Aquatic Magical Creatures. Under the guise of studying the changing populations of merfolk and other water-dwelling beings in Plymouth Harbor, Devon, Harry was to investigate one deeper concern. An old newspaper clipping, slipped into his hands by Mr. Weasley, revealed that a war hero named Jack Jones had left behind a wife and young son. Arthur Weasley had arranged every aspect of the assignment so that, should Jones perish in the field, his family would know he died defending them rather than abandoned them. By the time Harry arrived on the misty docks of Plymouth, house elf and wizard alike had already seen that each detail, from his lodgings to his transport, was in place. Back at Grimmauld Place, Sirius Black burst into the room, face alight with excitement. He'd just received Dumbledore's official blessing for Harry's new mission and could hardly contain himself. Grinning, he swept Harry into a tight hug and whirled him around once, twice, then let him go. "So," Sirius said, eyes sparkling, "what's the plan?" Ron lay sprawled on the 4-poster bed in the Ravenclaw dormitory, staring up at the canopy. "I'd already planned to invite you to the Burrow for the summer," he said in a flat voice. Harry sank down onto the trunk at the foot of Ron's bed. "Me too," he admitted. "I was really looking forward to it, but Sirius Black offered to take me in over the break. When that fell through, I felt I couldn't disappoint him, so I agreed, even though I'd rather have gone to your place." Neville Longbottom and Hannah Abbott, seated by the window, exchanged sympathetic glances. Luna Lovegood drifted in a moment later, her radish earrings swinging with each step. "Did you hear anything about the 4th-floor corridor?" she asked, referring to the sealed hallway where Professor Quirrell once taught. Ron sat up, his earlier melancholy replaced by eager curiosity. "That's exactly what I was going to ask. Do you know where Professor Quirrell has gone?" Harry winced, about to hush him. Dumbledore had stressed the importance of discretion, but then he remembered there was no explicit order to keep Quirrell's disappearance secret. Besides, Ron needed something to lift his spirits. "Honestly, no one knows," Harry said, running a hand through his hair. He described how the school had made no formal announcement, how the students' whispers in the Great Hall carried more weight than any official statement. And Hogwarts itself, with its 101 talking portraits, ghosts floating through the corridors, and gargoyles perched on archways, could never really hide anything. Word got around. "It isn't a cover-up," Harry added quietly. "Dumbledore's not trying to sweep this under the rug. If Quirrell vanished without a trace, well, it probably means Voldemort isn't gone after all." A hush fell over the small group. Neville bit his lip. "So we need to keep watch?" Harry managed a small, wry smile. "Always. In a castle full of secrets, portraits that gossip, ghosts that linger, the truth finds a way out. Dumbledore wants us alert, and that means knowing what's really happening. We have to look out for each other, because Hogwarts certainly won't let us forget." They settled back into the dimly lit dormitory, the weight of their discovery hanging in the air. Yet in that moment, comfort came from shared confidences, and from the knowledge that in a place where every painting is a potential messenger, They would never be alone in facing whatever lay ahead. Harry lay back against the cool pillow in the hospital wing, puzzled by how quickly news of Ron's mishap had spread. Why else would half the school know he'd been knocked flat and sent him a mountain of sweets? He decided to let Ron explain. "St. Mungo's?" Anthony said, raising an eyebrow as Harry mulled it over. "It has to be that so-called defense against the dark arts jinx. Every professor who's held that post quits for some bizarre reason, and most end up in St. Mungo's." "Dead?" Neville repeated, voice low. "But Harry rescued the stone from that hooded man. Professor Quirrell must have confronted him." The room fell silent. Everyone knew the story of the mysterious figure in the dark cloak, and Neville's theory made sense. Even Terry Boot and Michael Corner, who'd been perched beside Anthony, drifted over to Neville's side. "Okay, Neville, point taken," Ron said with a sigh, sounding half disappointed. "But it's not just a magic stone. It's called the Philosopher's Stone." Neville frowned. "Philosopher's Stone?" Ron gave a half smile. "Ever eaten a chocolate frog? You know how each comes with a collector's card? Dumbledore's card for Nick Flamel spells it out." He paused, watching their faces. "Flamel's over 600 years old. That's why everyone's after the stone." Harry exchanged a glance with Hermione. At last, the pieces were snapping into place. The real story behind the Philosopher's Stone, and those who would kill for it, was only just beginning to unfold. Ron sat forward, eyes alight as he recounted the incredible finale. It turns out Professor Quirrell was literally hosting you-know-who on the back of his head. Had Harry not managed to wrestle control away from him, well, let's just say Quirrell would never have fainted twice. We were all there, but nothing we did mattered. Oh, and he even killed the unicorn in the Forbidden Forest. In the end, Harry snatched the Sorcerer's Stone and drove off the Dark Wizard himself. He paused to catch his breath. Terry, knowing his friend well, slid a glass of water across the table. Ron drank gratefully, then wiped his mouth and grinned. Anthony stared at him in disbelief. "Wait, Ron, you actually said the name?" Michael leaned back, arms folded. "That's great and all, but you just sat there playing chess, right?" Terry chuckled. "If it had been you in that life-or-death chess match, Hesh, you'd have been knocked out on move 2, just like Ron, then murdered by the Dark Wizard who got the stone." Ron puffed up with pride and gave Terry a firm, mock-fatherly pat on the shoulder. Terry squirmed under the attention and silently wondered if he'd been wiser to stay quiet. Harry lay stretched out on the nearby sofa, utterly exhausted. In his stupor, he must have triggered a stray piece of magic. Terry called it Harry's infamous rainbow fart. A soft, shimmering haze drifted through the room, and one by one, Ron, Anthony, Michael, and even Terry's heads began to nod. Within moments, all 4 of them were fast asleep, dreaming of unicorns, enchanted chessboards, and the boy who lived. The next evening brought the much-anticipated end-of-term and year-end feast. This year's celebration felt extravagant, especially in the Great Hall, where every column and drape had been refurbished in Ravenclaw blue and bronze to mark the house's first House Cup victory over Slytherin in 6 years. Behind the high table, a massive banner bore the proud image of a Ravenclaw eagle, and throughout the hall, students from every house save Slytherins were already acting as if they'd won the cup themselves. Even the resident ghosts seemed to share in the excitement. Lady Grey, Ravenclaw's usually somber ghost, drifted above the Ravenclaw table with a rare, genuine smile, so radiant that the younger witches and wizards vying for her attention seemed completely spellbound. At the Slytherin table, the Bloody Baron's pale gaze fixed on her, and she quickly slipped back into her customary impassive mask. This time, however, she did not withdraw from the feast. Instead, she hovered expectantly beside her housemates, waiting for Professor McGonagall to announce the results. Nearby, nearly headless Nick, Gryffindor's ghostly herald, floated proudly between Dean and Siamus. He beamed from his floating head, muttering to his companions, "At long last, Slytherin's reign is over," as they all waited with bated breath for the final tally. Moments later, Professor Dumbledore stepped onto the raised platform, and the excited buzz in the Great Hall quieted to a respectful hush. He beamed at the students gathered before him. "Another school year has drawn to a close," he began, his voice warm with nostalgia. After exchanging a few more pleasantries, he held up a scroll. But before we send you off for the summer, it's time to award the House Cup. Here are the final standings. 4th place, Hufflepuff, 352 points. 3rd place, Gryffindor, 412 points. 2nd place, Slytherin, 452 points. And in 1st place, Ravenclaw, with a total of 476 points. A burst of applause erupted from the Ravenclaw table, while the other houses clapped more reservedly. Dumbledore smiled, set the scroll aside, and prepared to name the winners of the individual awards as the students leaned forward, eager to hear who would claim the next honors of the year. Chapter 219. Even Trolls Can Graduate from Hogwarts. As soon as Professor Dumbledore finished speaking, thunderous cheers and the rhythmic stamping of feet erupted from every house except Slytherin. At the Ravenclaw table, students raised their cups in salute to their hero, Harry Potter. Beside him, Ron Weasley stood and beamed as though the praise were his own accomplishment. Ryan allowed himself a small smile, convinced the ceremony was over. After all, Ravenclaw had already secured the House Cup, and surely Dumbledore wouldn't award any more points. But Ryan was wrong. Dumbledore cleared his throat, and the Great Hall fell so silent you could hear a pin drop. "There is, however, one more matter we must address," he said, his voice calm but firm. Before anyone could breathe, the Slytherin table erupted in uproar, shouts, laughter, and knowing glances flying from one student to another. The whole school watched as the green and silver-clad students congratulated each other, and in that moment, everyone understood why. Ravenclaw's champions, Harry Potter and Ron Weasley, had not only broken into the forbidden fourth-floor corridor, but had trampled over more than 100 rules along the way. The mere mention of fourth-floor forbidden was enough to send shockwaves through the hall. All eyes turned back to Dumbledore. The cheers and clapping died away, replaced by tense anticipation. Hogwarts had heard of many daring feats, but this one might just top them all, for better or worse. Slytherin still had a chance. Gryffindor in 3rd place trailed them by 40 points, and Ravenclaw, currently in the lead, was only 24 points ahead. Even with Draco Malfoy's inevitable deduction weighing against them, he and his companions had protected school property, so any penalty would be minimal. And as long as the standings didn't shift, Dumbledore would have no reason to drone on any longer. Yes, Slytherin was certain to claim 1st place. "Quiet, please," Dumbledore said, clearing his throat. At once, the Slytherins fell silent, eyes shining with expectation. Across the hall, anxious gazes from Gryffindor, Ravenclaw, and Hufflepuff silently pleaded for Slytherin's lead to hold. Dumbledore consulted his parchment. "I have a few final points to award. Let's see. Yes, first, Mr. Draco Malfoy." Draco Malfoy's cheeks flushed a rosy pink. Dumbledore continued, "For bravely confronting the raging fire and calmly deducing its true cause, I award you 20 points to Slytherin." The entire house let out a triumphant cheer. Professor McGonagall's clear soprano rang out above the chatter of the Great Hall. "I will award Slytherin House 50 points. A smattering of cheers erupted from a handful of delirious Slytherins, but most exchanged glum looks. They knew all too well what bonus points meant. No matter how high they'd climbed, these extra points would do nothing to secure 1st place in the standings. "No," someone shouted. "How is this a bonus?" Another cried. "We've just reclaimed the lead. Don't we get to celebrate?" Their voices swelled so fiercely that even the enchanted ceiling's constellations seemed to quiver in response. Meanwhile, across the hall, the other houses quietly reset their expectations. Ravenclaw still held 1st place, and this awkward interlude only confirmed it. McGonagall tapped her wand on the lectern. Item 2. Mr. Ron Weasley delivered the most thrilling game of wizard's chess Hogwarts has seen in years. For that, I award Ravenclaw 50 points. Ron rose to his feet, chest swelling with pride. He'd faced down more than his share of pressure at Hogwarts and believed himself unflappable. Yet as polite applause drifted toward him, he couldn't help but feel slightly deflated. After all, he'd been talking up his victory nonstop ever since the match ended. When Dumbledore announced Ron's name for extra points, the entire Great Hall buzzed with approval. They all knew why he was being rewarded, and that more points were on the way. Percy's eyes gleamed at the opportunity. Leaning toward the O, "Their prefects," he boasted. "It's my brother, you know, my youngest brother. He just conquered Professor McGonagall's giant chessboard challenge." A hush fell as Dumbledore cleared his throat. Item 3. Harry Potter. The silence was palpable. For displaying remarkable courage and ingenuity in the face of danger, I award Ravenclaw House 60 points. Pandemonium broke loose. The sight of a savior emerging before them set everyone on their feet. Even though Ron had gushed about Harry countless times, no one could suppress their excitement when the name Harry Potter, the Hogwarts Quidditch star, rang out across the hall. Harry himself stared down at the untouched sausages on his plate as if waiting for fireworks to appear. Next to him, Ron pushed food around with a fork, his appetite drowned by disappointment. Nearby, Ryan shook his head and whispered to a fellow Ravenclaw, "Albus is downright crafty. He dangled Draco's bonus points first, just to quash any overconfidence in Slytherin. Now they'll think twice before expecting more." And with that, the celebrations resumed, the echoes of applause reverberating off the enchanted ceiling as the four houses settled in for the rest of the feast. The exam results arrived unexpectedly early, before the end of term, and caught Ron completely off guard. He now had to collect his own scores, with no time to spare. As expected, Ryan and Hermione tied for first place, but Hermione wasn't pleased. She knew a shared top score didn't mean they were on the same level. Several students had achieved a perfect 100. Harry was surprised to see he'd come third in the entire year, even after dropping a few marks in History of Magic. With his heart pounding, Ron finally checked his own results, and to his astonishment, he had passed. Not only that, but he'd exceeded the pass mark by a comfortable margin. His overall ranking wasn't spectacular, but simply seeing pass next to his name lifted a huge weight off his shoulders. One more thing, however, left Harry puzzled. He'd been sure Dudley must have failed and would be expelled or held back, but the rest of the list proved otherwise. Dudley had passed too. Harry didn't mind one way or the other, but he couldn't help feeling a little surprised. Ever since Dudley discovered he was a wizard, his relationship with Harry had improved dramatically. Dudley, ever practical, even took on odd jobs to help the family finances, and used his father's alumni connections to secure a place at Smeltings High School. Harry, however, was still trying to wrap his head around how Hogwarts handled grades. Ryan set his teacup on the side table and explained patiently, "Hogwarts doesn't expel or demote anyone for poor marks until you sit your OWLs in 5th year. It's after that point your results start to matter. If you don't earn a sufficiently high grade in an OWL, you're barred from taking the corresponding NEUT level course in 6th year. And it really comes down to each professor's standards. Take Snape in potions. He absolutely insists on an outstanding O on your OWL. Exceeds expectations, E, or acceptable A, simply won't do. Fall short of O, and you're shut out of 6th year potions. Most other teachers set their bars lower, and some don't require any specific grade at all. In fact, in a sense, even a Muggle-born student who scores Troll T in a few subjects can still make it all the way to graduation." Harry nodded, relieved to have finally straightened out the rules. Ryan picked up his tea again, content that he'd cleared up the confusion. That afternoon, it was as though unseen hands had emptied every wardrobe. Clothes, books, and trinkets were already stowed away in packed trunks. Neville's toad, Trevor, turned up shivering in a dark corner of the bathroom, evidently terrified by all the commotion. By evening, notices were plastered across every common room and corridor, sternly reminding all students that magic was strictly forbidden over the holidays. Chapter 220. The unexpected Neville's toad had always puzzled Ryan. Was its name Leaf or Foley? He'd never bothered to pay close attention, until now. As he sifted through his memories of that first morning at Hogwarts, a vivid image crystallized, the toad, then called Foley, crouching on the edge of the Black Lake. Later, Neville, or rather the toad's new keeper, had renamed it Leaf. Ever since the Battle of Hogwarts, Leaf had slipped into the lake itself, vanishing from Neville's side, and, it seemed, reclaiming its freedom. In many ways, both master and familiar had finally been released. Ryan's curiosity wasn't stirred by Leaf's escape, however, but by something far more unsettling. He discovered that Leaf possessed a hidden magical gift, subtle and almost imperceptible, yet powerful enough to render Neville completely oblivious to its own presence. At first glance, the effect resembled an invisibility charm or a disillusionment spell, as if the toad simply blended into its surroundings. But when Ryan delved deeper, he realized the mechanism was entirely different. This wasn't active concealment so much as a passive enchantment, akin to the so-called Smith family exception. Leaf remained perfectly visible to the naked eye. Any witch or wizard could see it if they looked directly at it. Yet the mind of its designated keeper, Neville in this case, was conditioned to overlook it entirely. The toad's outline, its movements, even its croaks, all registered briefly in the brain before a soft, automatic filter banished them from conscious thought. Ryan stared at the spot where Leaf had once sat, pondering the implications. A creature that could willingly slip beyond its owner's notice, what purpose had it served, and what other secrets might lurk beneath the surface of innocuous Hogwarts pets? The unexpected, it seemed, had only just begun. The power that the Smith family wields ultimately comes from the moon, but not because the moon itself is a font of magic. In this world, all supernatural energy originates with wizards. Their collective beliefs and definitions, what we might call group thought, shape and direct the magic that any wizard can tap into. The moon, in particular, serves as an ideal symbol. It is a lifeless, celestial body that merely reflects sunlight, yet its ever-shifting phases, waxing, waning, disappearing, and re-emerging, embody a perfect metaphor for hidden and revealed power. Of course, in physical reality, the moon never truly vanishes. It only seems to disappear from our view as it orbits the Earth. Wizards long ago exploited this illusion. By focusing their shared magical will on the moon's apparent disappearance, they warped human perception itself. The energy generated by that distortion became what they called secret magic. Over generations, the Smith family didn't just collect this lunar magic, they refined it through rituals and imprinted it directly onto their bloodline. Hence, their household power earned the ominous name, the Phantom of the Moon. Ryan's uncanny affinity for this power wasn't merely coincidence. His rare talent, known as thinking, allows him to conceptualize magic in abstract, cosmic terms. Had he never developed that skill, he might have gravitated toward grander concepts, black holes or white holes, the birthplace or endpoint of stars. But in the end, he found that the moon's cycle resonated most deeply with his own nature, and he embraced it completely. Leifu, by contrast, stumbled onto the same power by sheer luck, but once exposed to the Smith family's lunar essence, he absorbed it nearly as readily as Ryan. So it is that the Smiths, through centuries of gathering and honing secret moon magic, stand unique among wizarding lineages. Their Phantom of the Moon is more than a spell or a family crest. It is the living echo of every waxing and waning night, captured in blood and spirit. Ryan understood the situation, but that didn't stop a wave of depression from crashing over him. In his previous life, he'd been Chinese, and he couldn't help but feel the sting of irony. Their Ni, whose surname was Lai. How could he not take it personally? Brooding, he followed Hagrid and the other first years into the small boats that would carry them across the Black Lake to Hogwarts. Yet as he surveyed the students around him, heads bowed, eyes glum, Ryan found himself cracking a smile. Even the most virtuous soul can't deny a secret thrill at another's mildly embarrassing plight. Hogwarts's rules were as old-fashioned as Britain itself. Take the Slytherin students, for example. Many hailed from the nearby village of Hogsmeade and could easily walk home for the holidays. But school regulations forbade it. Instead, they had to strip off their wizarding robes, don muggle jackets and blouses, and make the long trek to King's Cross Station in London, all so they could board the Hogwarts Express like everyone else. He watched with amused detachment as anxious Slytherins fumbled with their unfamiliar muggle attire. Their disgruntled faces snapped him out of his own sulk. By the time he climbed aboard the Scarlet steam engine, Ryan felt surprisingly upbeat. Settling into a window seat, he watched the mist-shrouded peaks of the Highlands give way to rolling farmland. The fields grew greener and more orderly by the mile, and with each passing town, his spirits rose. The journey to Hogwarts might still hold its fair share of trials, but for now, Ryan simply savored the steady rhythm of the train and the promise of whatever lay ahead. On the other side of the carriage, Harry slipped down the aisle to buy treats from the unfamiliar witch who sold sweets on the Hogwarts Express. This time, he brought back a box of Bertie Bott's every flavor beans for Ron and Draco. Ron cracked open a bean and made a face. Ugh, booger flavor, he complained, but he swallowed it anyway. Mine's chocolate, he announced, relieved. Draco popped a bean between his lips and then looked at Harry with concern. So, Harry, what are you doing for the summer? You're off to the Dursleys again, right? But Harry shook his head. I thought I'd manage. Aunt Petunia and Uncle Vernon don't know we're not allowed to practice magic at home. Then I remembered Dudley's a wizard now, too. He's been taking lessons. Luckily, Professor Dumbledore arranged for me to stay with the Dursleys all summer. There's a blood protection charm on their house, so I'll be safe. A flicker of excitement crossed Harry's face. And in a month, I can go live with Sirius. Draco's smile faded. He leaned forward, voice low. Be careful, Harry. The Ministry can detect magical fluctuations in an area. They just can't tell who cast the spell. If there aren't any adult wizards around, they'll assume it was you. His words carried a bitter edge, the residue of that nasty scuffle with Dudley last year. The three boys sat in silence as the train rattled on toward their separate summer destinies. Chapter 7. The Trace. Where's the trace? Ron demanded, his voice edged with panic. It's that charm the Ministry uses to detect any magical activity around wizards under 17. If you, or anyone nearby, casts a spell to get us out of here, the Ministry will know exactly where it happened. Harry frowned. So I can't just apparate out? It's only good for pinpointing location, not identifying the caster, Ron explained. That means you can do the magic. When Ministry officials arrive, you just tell them it was the Dursleys' doing. Let Vernon Dursley take the fall. He'll get expelled, for sure. Draco Malfoy, leaning against the wall, snorted. The Ministry would believe Harry Potter over Vernon Dursley any day, and even if they discover your secret, Dumbledore would never let you be expelled. Ron grinned. Besides, Dudley wouldn't mind. If he never gets his Hogwarts letter, Vernon and Petunia would have a fit. Imagine the delight on his face. Harry's stomach twisted. He shook his head. I'm not dragging Dudley into this. Ron shrugged. Suit yourself. But just so you know, you really can use magic here with minimal risk. Remember how Fred and George nearly lost their minds last year, and the Ministry misplaced their Hogwarts letters? Fred was furious. He actually said, I wish they'd never sent it at all. Ron rolled his eyes. I asked what they'd been up to in the attic. They claimed it was some muggle trick, Ron finished for him, sounding outraged. Well, muggle trick or not, at least our wizarding family can do real magic whenever we like. Harry closed his eyes, weighing their arguments. The two of them, one a lifelong friend, the other once a rival, had convinced him of one thing. If he wanted out of this situation, he'd have to take the risk and cast the spell himself. As far as I know, Draco began, shaking his head, every pure-blood family I've met hires extra tutors over the summer, just so they won't fall behind any upstarts from muggle backgrounds. He sighed, kicking at a loose cobblestone. I was such a fool not to realize it sooner. All the old Slytherin houses claim to despise muggles, mudbloods, they sneer. Yet here they are, sending for special instruction when school's out. Their words and their actions couldn't be more at odds. Ron stared after Draco, crestfallen. Why didn't Dad tell me this? He muttered. Bill, Charlie, Percy. None of them ever practiced magic in front of me on holiday. Draco's expression softened. Your father, Arthur Weasley, is a remarkable wizard. Do you really think he'd cheat the system just for a bit of fun? He paused, then added with a wry smile, unless there's something bigger at stake. To anyone overhearing, it sounded as if Draco were speaking on Ron's behalf, defending his father's honor. Ron squared his shoulders, a touch of pride returning to his voice. You're right. Dad's brilliant. But even as he spoke, a flicker of unease passed through him. He couldn't have guessed the surprise that awaited them. Outside King's Cross Station, a stout Mrs. Weasley and her husband were pacing beneath the soaring iron and glass roof, their faces drawn with worry. Molly's knitting was forgotten in her lap as she peered anxiously up and down the platform, while Arthur Weasley adjusted his spectacles and checked his watch for the third time in as many minutes. Neither of them noticed the first students spilling through the barrier, too preoccupied with the secrets of summer tutoring and the unforeseen twists yet to come. Standing beside them, the proud Lucius Malfoy and his wife, now dressed in simple muggle clothes, examined a handful of photographs. In the distance, they could just make out a white chest, its fluffy surface gleaming in the sunlight.